are abstaining for conflict of interest. If you say those magic words, nobody can challenge whether or not it's legitimately claimed or not. In other words, the Urbana City Council leaves it to everyone's own conscience whether or not they feel conflicted or so conflicted that they should not participate in the vote. So again, if you feel that you should abstain because of conflict of interest, say so, and your vote does not then go with the majority. It's just counted as not having happened. Referring to, you'll see that the green sheet identifies appendix number 1. In appendix number 1, what I did was gathered the various standing rules of the council that have been passed at various times by various councils over the years. Actually, this collection has been gleaned from probably 30 years of me taking notes on these sort of things. So what I've put forth here is a suggestion that these are the ones that I think are still viable for this council, and in order to bring a little order out of chaos, I would suggest that at some point in the future, this council adopt these as our standing rules, or change them if you want. But right now it's a little difficult to tell which of our standing rules are still in force and which have been abandoned. Now, with regard to the standing rules, I'd just like to call your attention. One of them is actually addressing the preparation of the agenda. Who can put things on the agenda and when things cannot be put on the agenda, because we've just gone over them several times, so keep them off the agenda. I would encourage you to read that carefully. Rule number 2 is an important one, although I've rarely seen it come into play recently, and that is no committee meeting should ever be held the same day, the night before the council meeting. That was put in there because obviously in years past people were playing games. An important one too for each council member to observe is rule number 3, that each council member has 5 minutes to debate, and they can only enter into debate 2 times. That's so that we can get out of here prior to 2 o'clock in the morning. The rest of the council rules are fairly obvious and straightforward, including our committee as a whole, which is basically our version of a study session. The next appendix. Yes, sir.
Is the assembly of the creation of the agenda for committee of the whole different than city council meetings? Isn't it true that any alderperson can place something on the agenda? It doesn't require 2 people to put something on the agenda for the committee of the whole?
Mr. Roberts, I regret to say that I did not review in particular that rule before tonight. When a question comes up, that's when I go back and read it again.
Okay.
I'm sorry I don't know that as I sit here.
Is that what we remember? Perhaps someone else?
Yeah, I think that's correct. 1 person per committee.
2 for council.
2 for council, something
Yes,
like
okay.
that. But we'll double check that.
Going on, I realize I'm going kind of quickly, but Ruth said we had till 7:30, so I'm trying to keep to that. Appendix number 2 then, and this is a really important appendix. Here are 5 of the resolutions that are still pretty viable in our council procedures. And the first one is the what we call the resolution on resolutions. Some people find that a little strange, but you see the original date of this resolution was, well, unfortunately it's been amended in 1994, but the original date was back in the 70s when the latest cause from campus would come over here and we'd be asked to pass a resolution on, as I say, some latest cause. And some of the council members felt that they would really rather have a week to educate themselves on whatever it is that was being presented. So years ago, the council said no resolution will be considered by the council unless it's been first considered by a committee, which of course gives an automatic 1 week space between considering it and passing it. We did leave ourselves an out, though, that if 2/3 of the aldermen want to consider it, they can nevertheless consider it. But I'm not sure I've ever seen the 2/3 invoked, or if so, it's invoked very seldom. I think the aldermen have appreciated the protection of the resolution and resolutions. The second resolution is regarding petitions and communications, and that's meant to basically protect the public, that everyone has got a right to speak to this council for 5 minutes. Occasionally in the past, you may have noticed it on television or read it in the paper, we have had citizens come in and be very abusive to council members and/or the mayor. Fortunately or unfortunately, if that happens, you have very little choice but to sit there and take it, because they've got a constitutional right to sit there and abuse you all they want. A council meeting is really divided into 2 sections. The first section being the petitions and communications, where we have said the public's invited to come and tell us anything they want. We cannot interfere with that, other than putting reasonable time limitations on it. The second half of the meeting, when the council is actually considering legislation, that's a different ball game. There, the council can tell people, be quiet, we're not listening to you now, we're operating as a legislature. So bear in mind, there's 2 different parts to our meeting. But that rule, that resolution is meant to govern public participation. The next one's pretty obvious. It's the resolution requiring Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. The next one I want to call your attention is the resolution on sewers connections. That needs a little explanation. About 10 years or so ago, the sanitary district adopted a policy that nobody can have a new sewer connection unless they're in the city, or unless, if they're outside the city, unless they have an annexation agreement with one of the cities. This resolution is intended to outline the procedure whereby the city of Urbana gives such permission. It also, in the Section 3, provides for an emergency situation where the CAO can give an emergency consent to hookup. So those are the important resolutions. Well, there's one more here. Oh yes, mandatory adjournment time. Again, hearkening back to the late 70s, early 80s, when this council regularly or frequently went to 1:30 in the morning. This resolution was finally passed requiring mandatory adjournment at 11 o'clock, or if people really feel like it, it can be extended by 2/3 vote to 11:30. I'm going to skip over Appendix 3 very quickly because it is really filled with some subtle but minor changes to the code. Some things that both Steve and I have noticed over the years that we say, golly, if there were just an opportunity, we'd like to tweak that a little bit to make it more clear or take out an ambiguity. So I would encourage you to read it, because we're going to come back to you after things settle down a little bit and ask that these various code sections be considered for amendments as suggested. They're only to clarify ambiguities or contradictions. But it'd be a waste of your time right now for me to try and summarize, and you're much better off reading those suggestions. They all go along with implementing what I'm speaking about now. The next one under Goldenrod, I think it's called, Appendix 4, is a primer on how to handle the abusive speech problem if it becomes necessary. I think if you read it, you'll see that basically what I say is the best thing to do is deprive the abusive speaker of the audience, actually get up and walk out. That ought to do it. We don't want to get involved in a court fight that we have interrupted or restrained their rights of free speech or any of that stuff. So maybe you want to just read that sometime to be prepared for the abusive speech. And the last one I want to call your attention then is the veto override. Frequently when it comes to the mayor disagreeing with the council, tensions get a little high, so I felt it best to lay out in advance just what the steps are in a veto override. You will note that it actually takes, veto override involves 3 separate meetings. The meeting in which the measure was passed, the meeting at which the mayor delivers the veto message, and the meeting at which the veto is considered for overriding. So I lay all that out in Appendix 5. Lastly, we're doing pretty
Can we
well.
run through that real quick? 'Cause this doesn't happen very often.
Well, I'm not sure what there's run through here.
Okay.
Well, the mayor delivers the veto message in writing to the council, and after the council considers it, then somebody moves to override the veto. This has got to be seconded, of course, and I think two-thirds vote, isn't it? Yeah, two-thirds vote of the aldermen then will override the veto, and the matter becomes law then, even without the mayor's signature. Lastly, then, I would just like to touch for a moment on parliamentary procedure and Robert's rules. For some reason, a lot of people feel a little intimidated by Robert's rules. Well, I don't. In all the years I've watched the council, it isn't necessary to master all the intricacies of Robert's rules. For the most part, 99% of the council's business can be accomplished by well, first of all, everyone should wait to be recognized by the mayor. That's very important for orderliness. And then all remarks from anyone are addressed to the chair. Nobody addresses anyone else personally. So then, to get the business done of the council, the main thing is a main motion. Somebody moves something, somebody seconds it, call for discussion, and at that point, obviously, amendments are in order. Somebody moves an amendment, somebody seconds it, the amendment's voted up or down, and after that's done, another amendment maybe is offered, voted up or down, and eventually, of course, then the matter is honed to the satisfaction of the body, and they return to the main motion and adopt it as amended, or reject it as amended. The other thing you see used once in a while, although very seldom this council, would be a motion to close debate or call the previous question. So far, it's been my observation that that's rarely done because all the council members defer to, everyone has had their say fully. So I've rarely seen this council vote to close debate, but that, of course, is available if people are droning on and on. I would like to,
And Jack, and the phrase for that is just I call the question.
yeah, call the question, close debate, they're all the same thing. Technically, under Robert's rules, I think they call it call for the previous question. But as long as the chair recognizes it as a call to close debate, non-debatable, of course, the chair will present to the body then that there's been a motion to close debate, and we'll now vote on that. I would like to see the motion to lay on the table not be abused by this council. A motion to lay on the table is really kind of an emergency motion. It's like, oh my gosh, the building's on fire, let's lay this on the table until somebody puts the fire out. Too often you see people try to use it to kill an item, and that's not the proper use of it. Probably the closest thing in Robert's rules to kill an item is to move to postpone it indefinitely. That really puts it off into limbo. So please be careful you're talking about laying it on the table, because, as I say, the proper use of it is an expectation that it's coming right back as soon as the emergency is over. Of course, anyone can rise to a point of order, parliamentary point of order or personal privilege, that sort of thing. And anyone, of course, has a right to appeal the decisions of the chair. All it requires is an appeal, motion to appeal the decision of the chair, second, and the body then votes on whether or not the chair's ruling on a parliamentary matter is overruled or accepted. It's basically that simple. Very seldom have I seen things get any more complicated than that, but if they do, we usually straighten them out. Just a couple other matters I'd like to remind you of. With the Freedom of Information Act, your emails are subject to Freedom of Information Act. So I would suggest the word to the wise, don't put anything in your emails that you don't want Mike Munson to have.
Right.
And regarding the
Charlie
open,
has a question.
Charlie, you had a question?
Yeah, I'd like to touch on the email just a little bit if I could. What are we allowed to communicate to other members of the council and the mayor without violating the Open Meetings Act via email?
That gets a little tricky, because if it's set up in such a manner that is in effect an email meeting, then I think we have problems. But you could certainly email one or two other altar persons and just say, how do you feel about this? But if you set it up to say, will everyone get back to me with a yes or no on this question, I think you're getting awful close to violating the act, and maybe. I haven't seen a court case on that yet, but there's certainly a lot of indications that email could be used to try and have a electronic meeting, and that shouldn't be done. Similarly, I have the same problem with phone calls. You could set up a conference call, of course, that would be the same thing as a meeting. So I would say be very careful of that, too. Well, as far as the Open Meetings Act, that's the last comment I have. I would remind you that any three of you meeting is a meeting, and it's got to be noticed 48 hours in advance with an agenda and recording and minutes and all that. And yeah, that completes my notes. I'll be glad to try and answer further questions with limited time. This is meant to be an overview, and I'm hoping that most of the things you have to have are at least summarized right here. Danielle?
Questions from committee members? Go ahead.
With regard to gifts, would you like to touch on that?
Gifts?
Gifts? How is food gifts, or how far do you take it?
You're referring to the recent state gift ban act thing. Oh, golly. I didn't read it recently, and I've forgotten just what the maximum gift is. I'm thinking $25. You remember, Bruce?
It might have been 50.
We better summarize that and get back to you.
I think it's 50, but I could be wrong, but I'm...
The reason I raised the question is we get oftentimes invites to come to dinner, and at the price of dinners in some places, they would far exceed that amount.
I'm pretty sure there's an exception to that, a dinner, unless it's an awful expensive dinner. Let me get you a summary of that, because they just, of course, passed the amendments about a year ago, and
Of course, we passed a separate ordinance, too, on ethics.
Other questions from committee members? Go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, I'd like to extend my email question. Okay, suppose I write sort of a position paper on my thinking on a particular issue and want to distribute it electronically to the other council members. You know, my intention may be to introduce it at committee meetings such as tonight. I actually have such a document prepared. Bruce was nice enough to print it out for me. I haven't emailed it to everybody, but I would have liked to have emailed it to everybody in advance of tonight's meeting to save time.
what would concern me there is not so much you mailing the original paper out, but now people are getting back to you and say, Charlie, what about changing paragraph 3? And you getting back and say, I'd just soon not change it because of, and we started to get an email colloquy on it. But just emailing the original document, I wouldn't be too concerned about. It's when it starts to be a colloquy.
Okay, so mailing it, saying this is what I'm going to bring to council is okay,
Yeah.
but there should be
Please
no
don't react.
Please don't react. So no discussion afterwards. Okay, that would work. That would have worked perfectly.
That's right.
Quick follow-up question to that. It's my understanding that two council members can talk by phone, can talk by email, et cetera, about pending council business. That's correct?
2. Mhm.
Two. So if Charlie were to send out a position paper and request feedback and say, please do not reply to all, I'm happy to have individual conversations with you if you choose to call me, et cetera, that's the same thing as getting on the phone and having one-on-one conversations with people. It's just using an electronic medium for that. So my question to you is, it sounds, based on what you've said, that actually that would be a violation of the Open Meetings Act, to have individual one-on-one conversations via email with council members after sending out a position paper to all of them. Is that correct?
Well, that could be. one of the problems is, don't forget, this is a crime then to violate the Open Meetings Act. So you always want to err on the side of caution. I still think Charlie sends out his position paper, and you and he talk about it. I think that's all right, but now what I'm concerned about is when it gets to be, he talks next to Mr. Lewis, and he describes to Mr. Lewis what you said, and pretty soon there's really more people in on it. So I really kind of prefer that there be no feedback on this email thing, but I'm not the final arbiter of that, because it'd be the state's attorney that would bring it. And the jury may say you're not guilty, but we don't want to go through a jury trial to find out what the answer is there.
It does obstruct council business for council members to not be able to speak to one another and have conversations. So in the interest of the city, we should figure out exactly what it is that, for example, I would not want this council to be frightened that an individual calling another individual council member to discuss an issue, particularly because there are shared projects that people are working on, that conversation of two would be suspect. Now, there's nothing that I've read that makes it appear that a conversation between two people would ever be, except for maybe if the conversation were to, if I were to say, well, Robert gave me this document, Charlie, here's the document, that to me seems pretty clearly to be communicating amongst three. But communicating amongst two is certainly not a violation. So I just want clarity, because I don't want there to be fear that blocks our ability to do council business and be stewards of the city. And your interpretation that you're giving of the Open Meetings Act is different than the interpretation that Steve Holtz had given to council 4 years ago. And so in that way, it's a little disconcerting to hear that, because we've had a policy that if you send out something via email, you make it very clear that you don't have a reply to all. And so instead, you can have individual conversations, but there should never be sharing of emails with other people, et cetera. And that's been council practice. Now, we're not a judge, a state judge or something, so I'd like some real specific clarity on that, and a recommendation from your office on that.
Yeah. Well, the difficulty is, Steve and I can agree or disagree. It really depends, what does Julia Reitz say? And,
Well, perhaps we should ask Julia then.
if she'll give an opinion, as usually, for example, I cannot write to this State of Illinois Attorney General get an opinion. They don't talk to mere city attorneys. So Julia Reitz is the only one that can get an Attorney General's opinion. Certainly ask her what her policy would be in such a situation.
Okay.
I wasn't aware that Steve had taken his guess on this question.
Any other questions from committee members? Okay. If not, is this the end of council orientation? Did you have other things?
Just a couple things.
Okay, go ahead.
One important aspect of orientation that we're not able to get to tonight, and we weren't able to get to it on a previous occasion, is the matter of conflict of interest. Now, you did receive a very comprehensive booklet on that was a compilation of sort of similar to Jack's on procedure by the Champaign City Attorney on conflict of interest, and it's exhaustive in its detail. So we do plan to get back to that at some point. We do have officials from the Department of Housing and Urban Development coming in next month. You'll be receiving more detailed information by email on this regarding the times and dates that will be available for that. I believe it is one evening that we're going to try to do staff members from Champaign-Urbana and the county on an afternoon, and then hold these folks over for an early evening meeting so that we can do HUD conflict of interest training for those who wish to attend from Urbana, the county, and the city of Champaign. So those that is coming in a lot more detail. So we'll get back to that. In the meantime, just a couple of rules. One, we need to determine if any of you own property in a TIF district right now. If you do, you need to disclose it. As a council member, you cannot buy property in the TIF district and retain your seat as you're a council member. What might be obvious is, back on the HUD issue, is you cannot take money for yourself or your employer or your neighborhood organization that you're an official in from the federal government and be in compliance. There's the whole notion of the revolving door policy. I don't think I really need to get into that now. I don't think anyone has that problem. You can't buy any property at city auction. There's just the common sense things, and if you just have common sense until we can get into that more detail, I think you'll be fine. If you have any question whatsoever about a matter, and I know Lynn's already discussed some of this in terms of her employment relationship, please call myself or Jack, and we'll figure it out and make sure that we're all above board. So we'll work with you on
Bruce,
that.
would any fundraising be a conflict of interest when it comes to, if you've done fundraising and received money from different companies, would that be a conflict of interest?
Well, I think what we'd want to do is to look at the details of that. Who benefits from that, what your role is, do you get compensation for that? If we look at that in detail, we can probably make an opinion.
Okay.
So we'll do that.
Curiosity.
Other questions, Dennis?
And you mentioned property ownership in a TIF district, and are you talking about business property, residential property?
Any property.
Any property.
That's right. What the Act requires is that as the new council member comes on board, that it be disclosed, and then you would have to recuse yourself from any consideration of matters within the TIF district. Once you're already on the city council and acting, at that point you're prohibited from purchasing property in a TIF district and retaining your seat. So we've had some experience with that. So again, but those are just simple rules of thumb. But anything that's detailed, or if you have any question whatsoever, just call us and we'll look at it. A couple of minor orientation matters. It was sent to me by email that you might like to have your nameplates changed. Is that something that you want to have done? The only thing I would say is we need to make them bigger because you can't read them. If we go any smaller with the word information, you can't read them from there. We're going to get larger ones with your first name, last name, and ward. Is that what you want?
Charlie, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, that was one of the things we discussed Sunday night, and we would like to be able to address each other by first name on many occasions, and figure the public should be able to see our first names too,
Okay.
so they can follow along in the discussion.
Okay. So we'll change this, and we'll need to change them for the planning commission and the others too, to get them to fit in the little slots. So we'll figure something out there the next couple
I
of
think
weeks.
that, the slots are big enough that they'd hold it even if they were wider than the slot.
Yeah, we can make them
so,
wider.
Yeah.
Okay. Business cards, I think the best way for us to organize that is probably to go through Debbie Roberts or Phyllis at the clerk's office. Debbie had volunteered for that earlier. It's important to give us what you want. I'll give the clerk's office exactly what you want on there, which numbers you want, which ones you don't want. So be clear on what you want on these cards, and we'll get you 500 to 1,000 right off the start, so you'll have those. Any questions about the upcoming schedule for the meetings? It's very aggressive in the next couple of weeks. Just to review, we do have a couple of meetings on social service funding that we have scheduled yet this week. Those start at 6 with, I believe we still have some box lunches at 5:30 on that. That meeting's been noticed at 6 for a couple hours each night. Next week, we have rented a bus to review points of interest the city staff has come up with, as well as members of this body have come up with to visit in terms of orientation. There will be that will start at roughly 5:30, and there will be a box lunch on that. We'll come back from that tour. The bus will come back prior to 7:30. We'll have a small break. We'll start the council meeting at 7:30. On tap is the city budget. We'll also meet then on Wednesday at 7 o'clock, which would be the 18th, on part 2 of the city budget. So you have a very aggressive schedule, and I bet we can do better next year once you're acclimated. So any other orientation questions, anything that we need to be doing at staff to get you set up?
Other questions from committee members? Just to add that I've been collecting the vacation schedules of the council members, and so after this slew of meetings that we'll be having in the next month and a half, we're looking at trying to coordinate vacation schedules. I want to coordinate with staff as well, and the cycles for staff. Probably after the budget, we're looking at something some, a week off essentially so that council members can go into summer vacation. So looks like some council members are taking off around the same time, so it looks like that might end up being convenient. There'd be a single convenient time for everyone. If you haven't gotten me your vacation schedules yet, please do. Other things? Okay. If not, we'll move on to additions to the agenda. Are there any additions to the agenda from the committee members? Charlie?
I have two items to add for discussion at the end, if we could. One is related to mailings, and the other is is a small change in the rules that I propose concerning how the committee chair reports to council. And I'll have something to pass around on that when we get there.
Point of order, Jack. If we add two agenda items on the end, are you intending that there be a motion on some of these?
Only to send it to another committee meeting.
Okay. Is that permissible if it wasn't on the agenda that
It
was?
could be considered, but you can't act on it.
Okay. So it can be considered and sent to another committee meeting, for example?
Can we not send it to committee, just, maybe I'll take your suggestion and run with it?
Okay, it's for discussion
It could be
purposes
considered
only?
but not acted upon.
Okay. Okay. So we'll add that as 13 and 14 and move it adjournment to 15? Is there a staff report? We already heard from staff, but is there additional? Okay. I'd entertain a motion for approval of the minutes of the previous meeting, April 11th.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion, a second, any discussion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Excuse me.
Excuse me.
Brandon?
Yeah, I would like to make one motion to amend. At the top of pages 2 and 3, there is a date, which is incorrect. The top of the page says that these are the minutes from March 28, when in fact these are the minutes from April 25.
This is page 2?
Yeah, at the top, the very top of the page, at least in my copy,
Yeah,
you have the
yes.
wrong date.
Right.
And actually, on today's meeting agenda, these are listed as the minutes for April 11, but it should be clear to everyone that these are the minutes for April 25, as they say on page 1.
So the changes are,
At the top of page 2 and 3, I move that we change the date to read April 25, 2005.
are there, the motioner and the second, do you have any concerns with that? Okay, if not, we'll roll that into the motion. Okay. Anything else? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That carries. Next, we have public input. Those who are here to speak before the committee this evening, if you just fill out one of the cards in the back that looks like this and bring it up to the clerk, you'll have a chance to speak for 5 minutes. Robin Arbiter from 1317 Philo Road in Urbana with Pace Incorporated.
Yeah, that's where I live, where I work. I guess I could have given you my home address.
If you could just give us your home address at the beginning of your statement, that would be great. Thanks, Robin.
Okay. Well, this.
Yeah, pull it up.
Hi, I'm Robin Arbiter, and I live at 1511 Hunter in Urbana, 61802. And I'm the Director of Programs at PACE Incorporated, your friendly neighborhood disabilities information resource center. And I just wanted to introduce PACE to you all and say how glad we are to have all of you new folks on board. It's an exciting time, I hope for all of you and certainly for PACE, because it's been a long time since there's been this kind of a turnover, so we look forward to a lot of new relationships with all of you. I wanted to just say a little bit about PACE, and I'll let you know we're a 20-year-old organization. We advocate at the personal and systemic level for the full inclusion of people with disabilities into all the rights, responsibilities, and opportunities that are promised to all Americans. And how that's particularly played out in Urbana is through a lot of advocacy and work related to housing, assisting people with disabilities transitioning from nursing homes to home, and assisting people to remain in their homes through the use of personal assistance. And so we've had some collaboration with the city because you guys have been kind enough to fund us in years past. But more about PACE that I think is worth knowing is that policies of PACE are set by a board which is mandated to have the majority of its members be people with disabilities. So we're not representing people who are different from us. We are representing ourselves and our families. In addition, our staff is also composed by a large number of people with disability management experience. We are very proud of our relationship with the City of Urbana, and we are proud of the City of Urbana's commitment to visitability, which allows new home construction supported by the city to achieve certain standards of basic access so that neighbors with disabilities can visit other neighbors. And this kind of ordinance sends an important message of welcome to Urbana residents. And obviously, as a person with a disability myself, and for many of the people that I work with, we would like to push that further. And so in the next 4 years, hopefully we'll get to do that together. We can improve access in Urbana in lots of areas, and PACE staff is willing to provide both technical and practical assistance to do that. Also wanted to just acknowledge that Urbana and Cunningham Township have partnered with these projects that I've talked about in a modest but very profound way. And in recent years have grown some programs with PACE in a very thoughtful and planned out way, which we hope will continue. But in any case, I wanted to just say that we are your neighbors. We are a local business. We are a center for volunteerism. We attract many Urbana residents to do volunteer work, particularly, not really particularly, but we do attract many seniors from Florida House, many people from Steer, and as well as people from across the dividing line from Champaign. But we are a center for volunteerism in Urbana. And we are a resource for individuals and entities seeking information and referral and assistance related to disability issues. We work with people with all disabilities, and we are already calling on you, as some of you might have checked your home phone messages and heard my voice earlier today. And we hope that you will call on us as well if there's anything we can provide you or any of your constituents. We look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee members? Thank you, Robin.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anyone else here who'd like to speak before the committee this evening? Okay. If not, we will move on to the financial plan presentation. And council members most likely will be projected up here as a PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does everyone get a copy?
I didn't bring it with me. Thank you.
What we'd like to do tonight is to start with some of the financial documents that we utilize here at the city. There are several documents that you will approve and review as a city council. I kind of think of them as, in a kind of odd way, that those of the past, which you'll receive, which is like an audit, which you will approve, and a consolidated annual financial report, CAFR, that you will receive, which is a historical document. Then we have those documents that we operate in the present, which is basically a budget which lasts for 1 year, that has the operating aspects and funds of the city for a current fiscal year. And then we have future or forward-looking documents, one of which we will review tonight, which is the financial plan, and the second one we will review tonight is the capital improvement plan. Now, these documents take assumptions and what we know today and try to project them forward so that we can better make decisions today about where we're going to be in the future. Ron and I annually present to the council the financial plan ahead of the budget, because you'll want to take a look at what we have in terms of our assumptions prior to making decisions with the upcoming budget. We have found over the years that as a legislative body that you can better make short-term budgeting decisions if you take a look at those decisions in a multi-year context over a longer period of time. We use the financial plan to review changes in our financial condition annually, and we look at the financial plan to outline for you the assumptions that we use in the preparation of the budget. And lastly, we see the financial plan as an educational tool. It provides significant information on many of the special funds that we have at the city that are not contained, there's not narratives in the annual budget that say, historically, why do we have this particular fund? What was its purpose? Why was it created? And so we go into more detail in a narrative form of how these things happened over a long period of time. And so we use that not only to educate council members on how some of this came about, but we use it internally to educate staff on, why are we doing what we're doing? What's the history of this? So we do think it's an important document. Some of the factors in this upcoming financial report that we'd like to highlight for you are factors that will impact the budget that is being assembled as we speak, and will be provided in the next couple of days. One is, of course, the state budget. We continue to have less than robust revenues from the state budget, and we'll go into that in more detail. Obviously, you'll quickly realize this as a council member. Our operating costs always increase. We're a people organization. 75% of our budget goes to people. People require health care insurance, pensions, and wage adjustments, and you'll see, we'll go into more detail. Those are they're pretty predictable in some respects and are increasing over time. We'll review for you revenue trends that are both good and bad that relate to this upcoming budget. There are a couple of good things that were problems for us in the past. One is the completion of the library project. This impacts our financial position dramatically. All of the grants that were outstanding, the $450,000, have been received. The project was built on time and roughly within budget. There's still a few loose ends, but not many, and we now know what it's going to take to complete that project. Secondly, on the positive side, I guess you could say it's positive, is that we had an unknown liability financially with respect to the landfill. The leak that we had, that we discovered almost 2 years ago now in terms of the landfill, was a problem. We did not know how much money it would take to fix that problem in a responsible way, and we now know that the tab on that is $1.3 million. Back on the state budget, a couple of years ago, we lost some revenues, the photo processing tax, $120,000 a year. We lost that. That impacted our budget. Pension mandates by the state, this impacts our budget dramatically. Probably the pensions from the state are the most important factor that impact our bottom line. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but those are up dramatically. And then income tax. We're basically caught up to where we were 8 years ago with income tax. There was significant erosion in income tax revenues over the last several years, primarily related to the relationship in the state economy and the nationwide economy, and with the bubble that burst in 99-2000. And really, we're just now coming back to where we were from an income tax point of view. If you'll recall, 10% of the total state collections of income tax are forwarded back to municipalities. And again, that's something that we need to watch. There has been talk over the years of reducing that percentage, and of course that would have a very devastating impact on our budget. In terms of operating costs, the pensions have really gone up a lot over the last few years. And we're predicting 12% in terms of the costs, and Ron's our pension expert, and he can go into that in a little bit more detail if you'd like. But we have this odd situation in pensions. There are many factors that contribute to the costs increasing over time. Folks are living longer. The cost of pensions go up with wages, obviously. And then we are in this unusual circumstance where the Urbana taxpayers pay whatever the state legislators determine would be the benefits for our police and firefighters and IMRF. So those benefits are determined outside the city of Urbana, and we don't have much control over that. So that's an unusual situation, and as a result, those have been up significantly. We're looking at about 10.6% increase in our health insurance costs. We're actually happy with that. But again, you'll see this in more detail in the budget next week, but this is a factor that dramatically increases our costs over time. It's been double-digit increases for a number of years, and certainly has an impact on our bottom line. Wages up about 3.2%. Those are that's a combination of all the various groups that we have. As you know, we have FOP, ASME, and IEFF, as well as non-union and management. All of those wages total about 3.2%, or about what we assumed would be the case in our projections. By the time you factor in pensions and you factor in health insurance costs, our total labor costs will be up over 5%. So that's a big factor when you consider the next point, which I mentioned before, that 75% of our costs are in personnel. I want to talk about revenue trends, and I think Ron and I will just go back and forth on that. Maybe I'll start with utility tax briefly. Well, first of all, let me go to this one. One thing that is positive about our revenue mix is that it is mixed. If you look at this diagram, you'll see that one of the reasons that we have some stability in the city of Urbana, as opposed to a school district or another taxing district totally reliant upon property tax, is that we have multiple sources of revenue. Again, the state income tax, and maybe in normal years might go up somewhat with inflation. Fees and fines we're in total control of, and the council's passed an ordinance that increased those over time roughly with inflation. We have a utility tax, we have sales tax, and property tax. So all of these five are contributors to our total income stream, and to the extent that there's a mix here, we are more stable than many governments. In terms of the utility tax, we're about 20% of our revenues. This, of course, is a 5% tax on power, water, and telecom. As you've no doubt been aware from emails and discussion in the newspaper, we have the situation where will lose or are losing $250,000 a year to the university because of the switch from Ameren IP to Abbott in the generation of electricity. Again, the university must do what is in the interest of the university. They have the right and obligation to do what they feel is in their interest to provide power at the least possible cost, and certainly under review on that. And they've made the decision that it's better for them to generate more electricity on campus than to purchase that from Ameren IP. And as a result of that, we are a casualty. The casualty is that we don't collect a utility tax on power generated by the university. This leaves about a $250,000 loss in our utility tax revenues. As you can see, even with that, we're up fractionally. You'll see it in the budget, I guess. We're still up fractionally, and we have included, based upon our feeling that we'll get this done, a phase-out period of $200,000 within the current fiscal year and $200,000 next year, payments from the university to the city as a part of an agreement that in effect provides a phase-out. But and that's great, and we're absolutely thrilled with the university and their leadership that we could get that done. But the bottom line is there's a hole, and we would have liked to have done other things with that $250,000. Utility tax is probably one of the hardest ones for us to predict. Fluctuates greatly. Maybe you should address this chart.
Well, the only real reason I put these next 3 or 4 charts in is to show the volatility that we've had in our revenues over the last 5 years, and it hasn't always been that way. For example, in the utility tax, we had tremendous increases in the cost of natural gas. Then we had the growth in the cell phones. Now we've had the decrease in revenues in the cell phones, and we've had the loss of and the utility tax from the University of Illinois. So when we get to the budget and you see some of the detailed revenues, like on utility tax year to year, you'll notice that I try to pull out and separate any unusual occurrences, one-time, non-recurring occurrences, so that we can understand what's happened in the utility tax. We can help project forward. And if we're going to lose $250,000 from the University of Illinois, is it just a one-time thing that we're going to incur this year and we're going to recoup it next year, or is it an ongoing thing? And so, and you'll see a number of those in all the revenues. So the pink line there is about where the revenue should be to keep up with the expense side, just kind of approximate. So you see that in 03, utility tax grew at over 15%, but in 04 it dropped down almost to a negative 2.5%, and not the same for next year. So
When Ron says expense side, we're talking about the 5% is roughly the amount of money that it costs to operate our government at the current service levels each year. So it's going up 5%. And then, a good measure of that is where are those revenues with respect to that. So that's what's meant there. And of course, that $250,000 is recurring on the university. Sales tax is 28% of the revenues. Again, a good mix. We're projecting a 3.5% increase in FY06. The top two producers that we will have under the sales tax revenue of the city would be O'Brien's and Walmart, and those are under construction. And you will see in the budget upcoming next week that we have included some new revenues from these projects based upon their construction schedule. It's a little bit dicey, but you'll see next week that we did include some new revenues from these projects. This is just a chart that shows sales tax as divided by its revenue source. The one thing I would point out there is we're very high at grocery, drug, very high restaurant, bar, very high auto sales, and low on everything else. But the inclusion of Walmart and Farm and Fleet will over time change that, as well as any other retailer that we're able to attract to Urbana. This is a very dramatic chart. This shows sales tax per capita in Urbana as compared to some of our comparable cities in the area. You can see that we do not bode well on a sales tax per capita basis. If you were to take the next closest city, which is Normal, and calculate Urbana's per sales tax capita number based upon Normal, that's roughly about half of the total property tax in the city of Urbana. So that is remarkable. If we were to collect per capita what Champaign does, we could do away with the property tax. So you can see that this is a very significant issue for us. We obviously try to provide to the citizens of Urbana as many opportunities as possible to spend their disposable dollars in Urbana, and we need to do more of that, but trying to retain that would have a measurable impact on our revenue stream. These are just the projects under construction. Property tax, I'm going to let Ron talk about property tax. We've seen a dramatic increase in property tax the last couple of years. We're projecting a very healthy increase next year. We've been able to keep our tax rate at $1.31 for several years now, which is the same exact tax rate as the city of Champaign. Part of that is fueled by the new home construction. I want Ron to maybe give you his insight on the property tax.
Property tax has really carried us the last couple of years, and as anyone that's looked at their tax bill realizes, it's a combination of factors of the tax rate, which is $1.31, times the assessed value of your home. The assessed value of your home is approximately in Illinois about 1/3 of the value, the sales value of your home. And what the rate has stayed the same, but the assessed values of the home of the total Urbana are going up tremendously. They went up 9.8%. Projected in 06, and approximately that this current year, and that was even with some new mandated state exemptions, which are one time and will not occur next year. So part of that is the new home construction and the annexations, but another large part of it is just the growth in the sales value of homes. Properties in Urbana. The values, especially in certain parts of town, are going up dramatically. Those, of course, are set by the assessor. And so, you know, fortunately for us, if it hadn't been for property tax increasing so much, we would have been in a lot worse shape than we are. So we'll provide a lot more information in the upcoming budget about property taxes and where they're coming from and comparisons.
Just one thing for those viewing, and I know the council members, even the new council members realize this, but the city is only about 15% of the total property tax bill. By far, the school district is the largest generator of property taxes and is very dependent upon the property tax system in Illinois. The Park District is only about 9% and the county 8%. So you can see there the relationship between what we collect relative to the other taxing districts. Again, as Ron mentioned, the last couple of years, our revenues, not the tax rate, but the revenues from property tax due to new construction and inflation have gone up dramatically, and is above, as compared to the last diagram, is above dramatically the break-even cost increase line as opposed to some of the others. Another interesting dynamic, which is a result primarily of tax caps and of the lowering of the tax rate in Urbana by the city of Urbana, the difference between the property taxes in Urbana and Champaign have gone from over 20% to under 10% in the last 10, 15 years or so. So that's a positive trend. For those of us who've gone through it, where there's dramatic difference in the tax rate, it does make a difference in people's perceptions of what we do. Again, this is a look at property taxes after we began significant home construction. This is home starts compared to others. We'll have more information for that. It's contained in your book. Moving on to fees and fines, which is another important component of our revenue mix. It's 19% of our total revenues. Again, we automatically increase this by ordinance to keep up with inflation. We don't wait 10 years and raise it dramatically. It happens gradually over time. We have seen a significant increase due to building permit fees. This is the same 10-year chart that we've been talking about. State income tax, a very important 11% of total revenues. We're looking at and predicting a 3.5% increase last year. Let's go to this next slide, and you can see, we really lost a lot of ground. And this lags, of course. The bubble burst in 2000, really, and you can see people's income dropped precipitously. The amount that the cities received, the 10%, dropped precipitously, and we're only now getting back up to where we were. So, and if you throw in inflation on top of that, or what it would have grown to as compared to the other revenues, the gap is even bigger. So, I mean, that's pretty significant. I mean, that tells the story of where we've been the last couple of years. Factors to consider, I touched on them earlier. We're completing major projects. We always have that construction risk with a big project like the library. What if it went $1 million over? We have the same issue with landfill mediation. What if it went dramatically over what the costs were projected? But both of these risks now have been mitigated, and they're bringing in these projects, and we'll complete these projects within the budgeted amounts that we have had set aside and projected for them. So that's good to get that risk out of the way. Some of the assumptions that we're looking at in our planning for the next few years is that the property tax would remain constant. We're looking at pensions going up double digits for a few years and then normalizing back down to 5%. Maybe Ron can talk about why. This has to do with the lagging averages of losses, but this is the assumption that we're using. We're not looking at significant growth at this point in our planning assumptions beyond a couple of police officers in the next fiscal year. So we have to do something and make some assumptions, and these are the assumptions that we made, and then we project this out based on that. Over the long term, we believe that a couple of projects will generate at least $700,000 a year in new revenues for us, and we're including that over time. We're looking at double-digit healthcare costs, and we're looking at wages and contracts basically within the CPI. And we've been able to do roughly cost of living is where we've been the last decade or so, and we're not expecting anything significantly different than the types of raises that we've bargained in the past. And if you throw all that in, that goes into our planning assumptions. Another issue that's out there is the MetCAD radio project. At this point in time, we're including no new expenses within the budgets for that. May go into that in a little more during the police presentation during the budget process, but there is a significant liability, contingent liability out there that will impact all the users of MetCAD, and that is to replace the radio system, which is a multi-million-dollar project that will need to be accomplished in the next couple of years. U of I phase out, we talked about that. So what we have then is the famous yellow chart, which is a projection of all the assumptions that we've made on the revenue side and the assumptions that we've made on the expense side. And you can see that we're roughly in equilibrium right now. A couple of things have to happen for us to balance revenues and expenses over time. There are only limited choices that we have when we're not in balance, and those limited choices are to borrow, to cut services, or defer from projects, which we will do in part, or to raise taxes. And so those are the decisions that you have when we're not in equilibrium. One of the goals that we have is to always keep pushing out that point where we're significantly in deficit, either through new development, new revenues, economic development, or controlling costs. But I do want to say one thing, that over the last 4 years or so, the departments have really controlled costs, and we haven't added many personnel at all. We haven't added costs. We've asked them to make mid-year budget cuts. And we're pretty lean on the cost side, and that's happened over time. But so, you know, there's not a lot of flex in that cost side of the equation. It really would need to happen on the revenue side. And the easiest way out always is just new development. You need to grow the revenues at 5% a year to maintain. If you don't want to raise taxes or have new revenue sources from tax revenues, you've got to grow that budget to match the expenses every year, and that's roughly 5%. The easiest way to do that, obviously, is what we've been doing is through development. Special funds. There are a lot of special funds in your multi-year financial report. Social services, equipment services, VERF, which is Vehicle and Equipment Replacement Fund. Might as well learn that one now. We have the recycling budget with the LRC, recycling fund, the LRC, cable TV, and our retained risk funds. You don't have to learn all of this right now. Ron and I will, every year, we'll go over this in more and more detail, perhaps, more than you want. In the general reserve fund, we're projecting, that's wrong, I'm sorry, that's 630. I don't know how I did that. This is wrong. That June 30th, 2005 is 630,000, not 970. Want to point that out. That's the lowest our reserve fund has been in a number of years. It's a concern. It's something that we're going to need to address over time. But, you know, the landfill costs were the primary culprit there that wiped out our rainy day fund to fix the landfill. And one of the recommendations that you'll have from us consistently over time is we need to get that reserve fund back up when funds are available to a safe level that we can sustain an emergency. And right now we're very low. Just an overview of expenses. Sorry, the slide's probably misplaced. Just the relationship on our expenses, total expenses at the city. Economic Development Reserve Fund. There's a history of that in your multi-year plan. Expect about $1.7 million. From a technical point of view, this is available for any purpose of the city. It's been set aside by previous councils for economic development and to create development It was funded initially with payments that were made by the University of Illinois to the city. I have a history of that in there. We've added to it over time as we've sold various rights-of-way or streets to the university. We use this to fund projects that basically are not TIF eligible. Sunnycrest is an area that we fund from the revenues from this particular savings account. But it is a savings account, and in a technical point of view, it's this amount plus what we have in the other reserve is our total, if we really had an emergency. But previous councils have set this aside for use for economic development only. Significant amount of information in the TIF funds. The 4 TIFs that we have generate significant cash flow and have significant projects. TIF 1 is the oldest one. Believe it or not, I first started writing TIF 1 in 1979, and here I am, extending it another 12 years. But we just finished that, and that project has been extended, and that's significant to our financial future to extend that TIF 12 years to 2016. The difference in this particular TIF and the others, there are extensive payments to taxing districts. This gets into the relationship between the school district and the city and the relationship of school aid funding of the school district, particularly state aid. We have found that it is in the mutual interest of both the school district and the city to extend these TIFs because they can continue with state aid and the large amount of EAV doesn't come on to them, which is really a disincentive for them. So we work very closely with the school district and the park district. There are partners in this, and we collaborate, we talk all the time, and there is no difference of opinion as to what we should be doing in these TIF districts as it stands right now. TIF 1, if you think about TIF 1, is the core of the downtown. There are several projects that we need to look at in TIF 1 in the future, including County Plaza, Jumers, the parking deck, and other public improvements downtown. TIF 2 encompasses the remainder of the downtown, runs from 5 Points to the south side of Lincoln Square, including Lincoln Square. We just finished extending that life to 2022. This is very significant as it funds the redevelopment of both sides of 5 Points, the Stratford, Lincoln Square, other public improvements that we have going on. So this is very important to the mission of the city to make these TIF districts, and particularly TIF 1 and TIF 2. TIF 3 is an area that is located primarily in Census Tract 53. Expires 2013. There's some property acquisition projects planned for that. Probably the most unusual situation that we have there is the escrow of the Provena tax dispute. Since that's a TIF district, and since Provena was on at 0 before it was found to be taxable, and that's going to be argued in court for years, all of the payments did not go to the taxing districts, it went to the TIF districts. So what we've done is we've set up a separate escrow account for those funds. Whether or not those funds will ever become available, I don't know, but they're set aside. It'll probably be years before we find out, as well as with Carl. And those funds, at least we have the responsibility, since it's in the TIF district, of setting those aside and holding them. So if you see that number as an unusual number, that's the reason why. So it's basically just a set aside. TIF 4 covers the area on Cunningham Avenue from Farm and Fleet all the way down to 5 Points, but does not include 5 Points. Expires in 2023. Again, this is going to be the TIF that fuels our growth along Cunningham Avenue and to the north, and it will pay for the improvements necessary for economic development in those growing areas. And so to that extent, it's very significant to our long-term sustainability. It does contain significant taxing district rebates, not in the form of rebates, but in the form of projects for the school district and park district. As opposed to cash payments as were in TIF 1, this one includes projects for the park district and the school district. You'll see that in the numbers when you see the budget, and it's in your financial plan. MVPS is Motor Vehicle Parking System, which is an enterprise fund, accounts for all the meter revenue and expenses for the motor vehicle parking system, plans for parking expansion and maintenance of our parking lots. We have parking lot work going on right now at Lincoln Square, for example. I think in that particular one, that's a TIF project, but otherwise it would have been a motor vehicle parking system project. CIP, which is another presentation that you'll hear tonight, which is one of those forward-looking plans, is a 10-year project list of funding. It's much more complicated than a project list, and I'll give the introduction to that later, but it's a very significant document. We, in a relative sense, will be spending around $8 million in our CIP next year, so this is it's big money, and it is significant in terms of the maintenance of the infrastructure of the city and providing infrastructure to the newer areas that are developing. Over the last several years, we've been able, because we are in this very fortunate situation of having revenues over expenses. I really liked it when we had revenues over expenses. We're not there right now. But we were able to allocate, in addition to the library funding, another $5.2 million over the last several years to infrastructure projects. We increased brick sidewalks, we increased road maintenance, we increased projects that were related to development. And so we were able to beef up the CIP in those years when we had revenues over expenses. And those were, you know, and that's one of the decisions that you make when you do financial planning. When you're looking at your revenue stream in the longer term context, you know, you have a couple of choices. You know, if you spend all the money you have and down to equilibrium on staff, for example, well, those are going to go up 5% a year. And if you look at that chart, you'll say, well, I'm going to, you know, I don't want to hire people, then lay them off. And that's a decision that you make when you look out long term. One of the decisions that was made in that context was to say, well, in the past council, we're going to spend a little more revenues on one-time expenses, library, infrastructure, and use those excess revenues to fund those types of projects rather than projects that had increasing recurring costs every year. And, you know, good government would require a mix of those things over time. But in the last few years, we had focused on that. The upcoming budgets, we're just not able to avoid some of the new recurring costs that we need, particularly in public safety. So, in this next year, we're not able to fund the CIP in the amount that we really want to. We're about a couple $100,000 short of where we'd like to be. Typically, we're about $780, $750, somewhere in there, was it $750, on our annual contribution to the CIP. But again, this is a long term, and so if we're not quite there on one particular year, usually doesn't have such a dramatic impact for us. This is a separate document. You'll be getting your first presentation on that tonight following this presentation. Block grant, many of you are somewhat familiar with the block grant, but we've seen a decline of roughly 5% or so in the last couple of years in the amount we've received in federal funding. Again, the annual action plan and all that are separately approved, but accounted for in the budget and in the long-term plan. Pension trust funds, Ron, I think this is be a good one for you.
Pensions are important. We're going to spend about $3.8 million next year on our 3 employee pensions: policeman's pension, fireman's pension, and IMRF, which basically covers all the other employees. Well, we'll talk a lot about pensions and call them dirty names and stuff. It's important, I think, to realize that we're in much better shape than the state of Illinois, for example, or Social Security. We have always contributed the required amount of money to fund the pension fund. We have a professional actuary that comes in and does a study each year and tells us how much money we put aside, and we've always funded those. Even though we've done that, our funding levels are not at 100%. IMRF is at 96%, which is almost 100%, very good. Fire pension is 86%, which I still consider to be very good. And police pension has lagged a little bit. Right now it's at 66%. Where the state of Illinois, on average, the state of Illinois, I think, is around 50% on some of their pension funds. How can that be? How can we only, be underfunded if we've always put in the right amount of money? Well, it's because what happens is two things. One is the assumptions that the actuary makes. He makes assumptions on how much income the funds are going to earn. He also makes assumptions about how long people are going to live, how many disabilities we're going to have, what the pay raises are going to be, what they're going to be retiring at 25 years down the road, and what those benefits are going to be. And so some of those can change over time from what he assumes. Another real major reason is the state legislature is the group that determines what the benefits are. In other words, what your pension is going to be as a percent of your salary based on a number of years. They control that, and they pass the bill along to local government. So we don't. So probably in the next 4 years, you'll see some communications from the city, and they even ask elected officials to get involved sometimes when there's a pension bill before the legislature increasing the benefits that we think is unreasonable and that cost is great. Well, we want to make sure that at least the legislators know what that's going to do to local government if they pass that bill. And so those are important. Next year, our projected increase is 11.3%, and then 9% the following year, and then 7% after that. One of the reasons that the pension funds are a little high right now is because they all invest in the stock market. And professionally, they should be in the stock market. Most pension funds and large corporations are usually maybe 65 to 70% invested in the stock market. And that's because over a long period of time, history will show that the stock market will outperform by 2 to 3% any other investment. So it's prudent to do that. The problem with stock markets, of course, is they go up and down, and they really went down in 2000. They went down, in 2000 more than they had done since the Depression. So, and the pension funds, all three of our pension funds, use a 5-year average method in which they spread those losses or gains out over the following 5 years. So you can see in 2005, we're still feeling the impact of that loss in 2000. But the stock market at least has leveled out, hasn't come back like we'd hoped, but at least it's leveled out, so we won't see that huge negative impact on the investment returns. And the largest factor in all the actuarial assumptions and calculations is how much investment income is made by those funds. That produces more money toward the retirements than either the employees contribute or what the city contributes. So.
Might tell them how many million.
The total amount of money invested. The fireman's pension fund right now is around $16 million, and the policeman's pension fund is around $10 million. And IMRF, I don't recall how much is in IMRF. IMRF is a little different, and that's the management of that fund investments is controlled by a state agency, a central agency called IMRF. While the police and fire pension funds, we control those directly ourselves.
And of course, there's an employee share, which is about 1/3 of that cost. So, key factors in next year's budget planning as we look at our financial plan. We talked about utility tax down. We talked about new recurring revenues from economic development, which will allow us to do a few things perhaps in next year's budget. The shortfall is probably temporary. The year following that, we should have a surge in some of the revenues that we see because of the coming online. These projects, even though they're under construction, some of them take more than a year to build, so we lag behind. The assessment process is particularly brutal in that because we might be 2 years behind before we receive the real estate tax portion. But quarter after, O'Brien's opens and a quarter after Walmart opens, we'll see the new revenues from those. So we're projecting that. On the negative side, it's not negative, but it's reality is that we do have pressure to increase police services in the city of Urbana, and we want to try to accommodate that and try to do what we can to make progress in that area. We need to restore our reserve fund. We need to get that rainy day account back up slightly in the next few years, when we can, to have some relief if we're in a situation where we have another landfill nightmare. We're going to have to probably reduce just slightly our one-time capital improvement fund as we look at this to balance the budget. That should be no reduced services to citizens. Sorry.
It's a big difference.
Yeah. sorry, these are options. So, one of them is to reduce services. You'll see in the budget it says no reduced services to citizens. Another option would be to increase taxes and, of course, borrowing or use of reserves. And so those are the options that you have when the revenues and the expenses do not match. Long-term picture, it's pretty positive in many respects, but, we're under the methodical and constant pressure to keep up with our expenses every year, and that's, it's persistent, and it's 5% a year. And and we've been able to do it, with maybe the exception just slightly this year. We've been able to do it the last, several years, and so, part of that will be in how much the expense side grows, but, the easiest way to maintain services without any drastic change is just to keep that revenue stream increasing. So you will see then the budget in the next couple of days will be delivered to you. We'll use these assumptions in planning the budget. The budget will be provided to you as a working document, knowing that there may be certain changes that you want to make, where we'll make our best effort at providing what we think you will want. My guess is that you'll be pretty pleased with it. But again, we'll begin to talk about that next Monday night. When we start this budget presentation next week, in the past for Danielle and I guess Dennis really wasn't on board the last budget process, but we've kind of become sophisticated, and either myself or Ron just handles everything on the budget, and we haven't had a parade of departments for you in several years, but we're going to change that this year as part of orientation. Each department will have some slides, and they will give you an overview of what they do. What we do at the city is very comprehensive. It's very broad. It's in lots of different areas, and we want them to talk to you. It's not a budget pitch because we'll have the budget in writing, but it's to show you, give you information on what our departments at the city do. So that's kind of an orientation built within the process. So we're providing a little extra time for that this year. So that's what's in the game plan. Just to summarize again, the planning document that you have before you is similar to the next presentation. It's forward-looking. It's to give context to the decisions that you'll be making on a short-term basis in budgets. And this next presentation will be very much similar. It will be forward-looking, in this case 10 years. So let me stop here and see if there's any questions on the financial plan before we move forward.
Great. Thank you very much. Any questions from committee members?
I have about 10 questions.
Go ahead, Charlie. Fire off.
Page 3 of the document. In the second bullet point, you mentioned, which was approximately $350,000 less than the previous year. Is that $350,000 less than operating revenues or expenses? I didn't see
The difference between the two.
Okay.
Dropped $350,000.
Okay. In the let's see, you answered that question. Page 5, recycling I know that there's been some discussion about citywide business recycling that would include business. If you were to provide recycling services to everybody in the community, which I guess business being the only part that's left out, could we shift the cost of recycling the recycling tax back into property tax, for example? That was one of the items that Cliff Singer mentioned. And what would be the implications of that? It's something we could think about. Would it be more efficient to do it that way in terms of collecting the revenues, fairer to those? I don't know. Rather than having it as a use tax, and of course, if we're part of the property tax, it'd be tax deduction as well.
Well, let me point out, first of all, it says $27 a year per household. That's 30. Sorry, there's a mistake there. I mean, there's a lot of pros and cons to that. You know, we looked at that a long time ago and made some decisions to, I mean, we have a lot of service fees that are not property tax. And I think, you know, it's kind of in contrast to some of the other things that we've done to keep control of the property tax relative other communities. And we have dropped considerably. We don't have the reputation as the highest taxed community in the county anymore. Rantoul and 2 other towns have beat us out on that. So, but, you know, it really has had an impact on decisions of investors in Urbana in the past, and there was a sensitivity to that. There was also the notion in government of trying to attach the tax to those who benefit directly, in terms of, you know, trying to get as close as you can to those who benefit, to those who pay. The property tax is obviously, while deductible, is, you know, everyone pays. So, I mean, there's lots of pros and cons to that. The historical decision has been to keep the service fees and fees where there is a designated beneficiary to that service.
One of the things Mr. Singer didn't know about is we've recently come to an agreement with the Center District where they're going to include both Champaign-Urbana sewer benefit tax. He also mentioned as well the sewer benefit tax on their own one bill, so that will help somewhat in the cost that he was mentioning of sending out the various bills. It's not the recycling, but he also mentioned the sewer benefit tax as well. So we are trying in those ways where we can. We are trying to make it, you know, more efficient, easier for the you know, citizen to pay before we can.
Well, let me ask it alternatively, an alternative way then. Could it be possible to collect the recycling tax as part of the property tax, as part of the bill, so that it could be a consolidated bill?
And state it out separately on
Yeah,
the bill
right,
somehow?
yeah.
You know, I do not know the answer to that question. I'd have to ask the county clerk if that would be possible or not.
Okay. I guess the biggest question I have is one in terms of how the growth in assessed value has occurred. How much longer do you think, this is a real crapshoot, how much longer do you think this above the average rate of increase is going to go on? You know, you've got it projected at 7.6%, and you know,
I do not know the answer to that. Beyond next year, I think Joanne feels pretty comfortable that we're going to have the same type of inflationary growth in the values of the properties for next year. But beyond that, I really don't know.
And in your growth, in your projections, how did you take that into account? Did you drop it back after one more year, or?
No, you brought it down.
We brought
it down.
Yeah, we brought it down after, in the future, back down to normal levels. It's on the page with the yellow chart.
I've only got 2 more questions.
Why do the yellow chart? I had for next year, I've got it at 10%, and then in 06, 07, the following year, I got another 10%, but then I dropped it back to 6% for the year after that. So, assuming that thing sort of normalized.
On our workers' compensation costs, we self-insure, and so we have this fund that right now is at $3 million. Is that what we need to keep it at, or do we keep it at $3 million and just keep going by inflation now? And you've put in different amounts in different years to create this fund, but what does it have to be maintained at?
Well, I'd say we're pretty close to having sufficient money in there to sustain the programs that we operate out of there. If you were the history, we should go through the history of this. This is really important. I'll try to do it as quickly as I can. 10 or 11 years ago, we went to our employee. We really were in trouble on workers' comp. In fact, we became uninsurable, and our premiums were up at $550,000. Our safety record was awful, and we knew we had to do something. We went to, we made the decision to go self-insured. We went personally to every employee of the city, every group of employees, and said, if we can do better, we'll provide you more training, and we'll provide some incentive to you in terms of the benefit, a cash benefit, if we do better. Over over that period of time, we've been able to accumulate $3 million. We've paid out a significant amount of money to employees for incentives each year to be safe. Our safety record has gone from losses of 400, 500,000 a year down to we were as low as 28,000. I mean, we've really dropped that. As a consequence of those good years, we've been able to accumulate that money. The interest off that money is able to pay for the overinsurance, the catastrophic insurance, and the other costs associated with third-party administrator and the safety programs. So we're self-sustaining. Now, what happened to that $500,000, or it wasn't $500,000, how much was it? What's back in the general fund now?
Well, yeah, over time, it was reduced twice to now it's about $450,000
So we just
a year.
put that money is available and is being used by the general fund. So the amount of money that was being paid in insurance after we accumulated the money, because the interest off the money pays the program, is self-sustaining now. The money that was going to insurance has been allocated to operations of the city. So forever, we think, at this point, as long as we keep sufficient amount of money in there, that and we continue to have a good record, and even if we can even sustain some 4 years, but it should be self-sustaining.
So you're saying that we don't have to put any money in this year into that fund?
We've dropped it dramatically.
Okay.
And what happened to that money? Well, it's in operations of the city. So, it's probably one of the bigger success stories that we have, is that we went from paying out huge amounts of money and having poor safety record, which is bad for our employees, to much safer employees who receive bonuses from time to time for being safe. And we have a self-perpetuating fund that allows us to put the money that was going for premiums into operations of the city. So, pretty slick.
Okay. And so how does that work with the other liability claim costs? Because there's savings there as well.
Not as much. It's not as dramatic. It's smaller.
It was a lot smaller, and we just did it a couple of years ago. But so far we've been able to save enough. I believe 271,000 is what we will have saved in there at the end of 3 years. So, of course, it's important to realize that both in the workers' comp and the liability. I mean, eventually, sometime there's probably going to be a large claim. I mean, the odds just say that that's going to happen. Sometime in the future. And that's what that $3 million can be used for, as well as the 271,000. But we do buy excess insurance too, and so we're protected. We're not going to be wiped out by one single claim. We'll protect them.
Can the two funds be used together, or are they completely separate funds, or can they be combined in some way? Why do they have to be two separate funds, I guess, is what I'm asking.
I think it made more sense for me to separate them, because I wanted to show when we did the liability insurance, there was some concern that we were accepting some more risk, and the savings may not be sufficient. And so we did promise to everyone that we would keep track and report what those savings were, whether the program was working or not.
Okay, and thank you for indulging me. My one last question here is going back to the utility tax. Telecom is part of that. Do you get anything? Do you tax cell phone? Do we tax cell phones in any way?
We get cell phone tax on calls that originated within the city limits of Urbana and stay within the state of Illinois.
Stay within the state of Illinois. Okay.
But that is no, and that amount is decreasing because the price of cell phone usage is going down. The calls, a lot of free calls, and people are now beginning to use cell phones over the internet, of which we get no taxation at all from the internet. So. I just read an article that predicted in 3 years that all cell phone calls will be made over the internet completely. So we would lose almost virtually all of the not just cell phones, but all telephone calls in general, landlines as well as cell phones would be done over the internet. So right now cities can't tax the internet, except for cigarettes. Apparently that they can tax for cigarettes, local governments. But that's the only one I know of.
But the voice over IP has even a more dramatic effect on Metcad, we're not planning on going into that in much detail right now, or even in the budget. But as that's free from that taxation, and there's been a precipitous drop in the revenues that come from those calls because of voice over IP. So it's a trend we have to keep an eye on from a taxation and revenue point of view. Not for just us, but also our sub-agency, which is MECAD.
Well, you know how our landlines are taxed, or have a 9/11 tax on them. Can that same approach be used to cell phones that are located in, say, the city of Urbana?
That is controlled not by the city, but is controlled by the state, and then the voice over IP is controlled by the federal government. So, you know, everything I've seen is that that's not going to happen.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not an expert on it. We can bring in an expert if you want.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, Robert, and then
I
Dennis.
have one question, and that was, it seems as if you have considerable history in reviewing the various budgets over the years. Have you contemplated doing a viability study of the elements or the projections? Are the assumptions that you're going to make? I'm talking about a longer stretch, maybe not just 10.
Well, I think Ron is actually doing that. Ron looks at these revenues every day and keeps records. But, I mean, and he's on top of it, and he is looking at this in detail over a long period of time. If we didn't have that history of looking at this over a long period of time, I don't think we'd be very comfortable in making some of these projections that we make. But, you know, we do study it in depth, and we don't go out and hire it done. That's very expensive. We might get an audit from time to time on something, but you know, I think we're doing that. We're just doing it internally.
Thank you.
Good question.
Dennis?
Well, I was going to
go
start
ahead.
by saying, you know, I've done a lot of financial modeling, and I'd be happy to share those, and I've gone out beyond the 5 years, gone out 10 years, and one thing about the one predictable thing about the city budget is it's not predictable, and it has changed so much. It's unbelievable. If I looked at these projections, you know, 7 or 8 years ago, they were nothing what they are now, because things have changed so much. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because we're in a really a business that has 9 or 10 basic different services. We're not just providing utility to one person. We're providing all different services, and we got revenues coming from all over the board to pay for it. So it would make sense that those would change a lot. It's very unlike a General Motors that's just going to be make cars and sell cars. So
Which is not a good example these days.
yeah, that's not a very good example. So, but certainly, if we can do more to help in the projections, anything we can, I'm more than willing to do that. I'm not going to hold out, even though I've done a long time, that I have all the answers, because I know I don't.
He's pretty good, though.
Dennis, go ahead.
The only recent additional new source of revenue that's come before City Council this year, to my knowledge, has to do with the new program that was discussed but not adopted yet, and that is the landlord registration for concerning occupancy in certain parts of the city. If that program was put into place, did you come to any thoughts when you were asked to consider it as staff as to like the kind of income it might gender for the city? Is that negligible because of the limited scope of the area, or because of the number of potential landlord registrations, would it be have some impact on income?
Well, frankly, it would have no positive impact on income, and I'm not convinced. Well, what was proposed would be a net loser.
That's what you would project.
Mm-hmm. But still may be worth doing for other reasons, but it was not. It was not.
Well, it wasn't proposed as a revenue
right.
decision, but
it's my opinion that it's my opinion that the fees did not cover the costs.
Okay, I was curious about that. Thank you.
Other questions? Other questions from committee members?
Okay, I found one more that I have
Go ahead,
here.
Charlie.
Page 20, wages and union contracts. It says the firefighters contract expired June 30th of 2004. I assume that's incorrect.
Yes.
Where are we on the fire contract? Or is it the same as the
we'll
others?
begin negotiating in a year
Okay.
again for another 3-year contract. Sorry.
thought we caught that.
Yeah, I caught that too. I'm sorry. I think all three contracts expire June
Well,
30th.
we're not on the same cycle. We have fire, we have police and ASME on the same cycle and fire on the off year. We'll do fire next, we'll be negotiating and trying to settle in a year, and then we'll do the other two.
Other questions on the financial plan? Okay, I have a couple of questions. Let's see, looking at the pie chart, or the bar chart for social service funding on page 15, are these actual dollars, or are these dollars adjusted for inflation?
Actual dollars. Yeah. I haven't looked at this one for a while.
So we're looking at an actual dollar decrease from 10 years ago, which I guess the question to me is, what does that mean in terms of the actual value of the dollar? It would be nice to see the trends of our social service funding in terms of spending power, so to speak. So that's just one piece. I've been concerned about our social service funding because we have seen such a cut in township in the last couple of years. And I don't think we've seen a decrease in need. In fact, quite on the contrary here locally. So we're seeing the number of particularly children, homeless children, increasing, and have seen that trend, that increasing trend. And so the question is, as stewards of the citizens of Urbana, including the children, what is it that we're doing in terms of what are our trends in terms of social service spending over time? And it looks like those trends could be fairly dramatic if adjusted for inflation. So I'd like to see that particular trend.
One thing on that chart, if you notice that, the city, so it's really the three sources of social service funding.
Yes.
The city being the lighter green colored, and that you see actually has probably gone up a little bit over time. And the CDBG part has stayed approximately the same, probably. And where the drop is, of course, is in the count amount for the township.
Yeah, and I guess the question is, what are our long-term goals in terms of meeting our social service needs, given that the township, we've seen such a dramatic decrease in township allocation to social service funding. My second question is, one of the pieces of data I think would be really useful to see in this is the lifetime of tax incentives for economic development projects. So I think maybe the only place that's reflected is the yellow chart, looking at projections 5 years out, 10 years out, et cetera. But it's my understanding that there's a number of projects kind of in the works that currently are experiencing portion of tax abatements, that at some point that tax abatement will expire and we'll see significant revenues at those times. And I guess I don't really have a handle on what are the projects, when do they expire, kind of like the TIF in some ways. Can we see when the tax abatement is going to expire? What kinds of revenue projections do we see coming in at those points? And in particular, I think for new committee members, it'd be really nice to see what are the projects out there that are receiving incentives from the city? What do those incentives look like? When are they going to expire? What are the revenue projections at that time? I think it helps us in terms of long-term planning to be able to see that. So I assume that's somewhere, it's just not sitting here, and I wonder if we could get some data.
Actually, you have it for most of the projects because most of these are TIF projects. And if you go to the TIF expense sheets, you'll see, you can look up whatever project you're interested in, and you can see which years they receive how much money and how long the projects last.
That's in the
in the TIF cash flows. Now, the TIF cash flows are not really good. The projects that we know about, we put them in there for the term that they have a payment. There are other expenses that we don't know of at the time that are capital, so we don't list those, so some of the balances look large in those. But we do try to, if we identify a particular project, I don't know, let's take, 5 Points or Silver Creek or those you can see, or 5 Points West, we just did that. And there was one that, you remember, Danielle, we did just recently, we had 150,000 in 06, 07, and then thereafter, we were about 50,000 a year. If you go to page 36, you can see that in there. Now, it doesn't show specifically the revenues from that project in total, but it shows what we're paying out as a budget item. So we have almost all of them in there. So if anything that would be in downtown, Stratford, 5 Points East, 5 Points West, O'Brien's, anything within a TIF district, a Hampton Inn and TIF 3, all of those for their life, you'll see the expense side of it.
It's the revenue side, actually, that I'm more interested in.
Okay.
I mean, certainly, I understand we can see the expenses going out, but we know that's in a holding tank anyway called the TIF.
Right.
And so it doesn't, in terms of long-term projections, and in terms of talking to our constituents who may be pessimistic about the future of revenues in Urbana, I think it would be really useful to know when do certain things
When they pop out on the
expire?
other side.
When do they pop out on the other side? What are those, and what do we anticipate the revenues being from these particular projects?
Most of these, and we could do some work on that. We don't have that in a aggregate form right now. As a general rule, most of those incentives, because we've kind of developed over time a policy with the city council as to, how much would be a subsidy and for how long. Almost all of these projects have a 10-year term. It's not a written policy, it's just something that we've come to over time. It's about a 10-year term, and you'll see those in there. The other thing to remind you, this is only property tax. Now, a lot of these projects we do, and we provide the real estate tax incentive so we can get the sales tax.
Exactly.
So it'd take a little bit of work to put that together, but it might be something we can get on our list of things to do here.
Okay.
Help you out.
In terms of just a couple final questions, one, I don't know if this data if this is a huge project or not, but one of the pieces of information I think would be useful for long-term planning is what is the growth capacity within city limits without extension? What's the, there's a word for it, but the
Capacity?
yeah, well, it's the capacity and trying to figure out how much under capacity we might be operating at, looking at land that's not being used, lands that's underused, properties that have been sitting vacant for a period of time, and begin to gauge how close are we to that point of kind of saturation, such that then, kind of looking at growth in our boundaries makes more sense.
Well, of course, it's really difficult to figure that out.
Yeah, I think there's
I've been involved with the urban planning department for 30 years, and I've seen professors come and go that have tried to figure that out. I've tried to figure it out myself. It's really, really difficult, and it is more an art than a science to get a feel for that. And particularly, you need an intimate knowledge of the community that you're looking at. It might be a little easier to figure out in terms of the infrastructure side. Some things are easy to figure out. How much area can you grow before you have to do interceptor sewers, which are a huge cost that somebody has to pay. What is the service range for the fire department in terms of everything else being equal, response times? Some factors are fairly easy to figure out. Others are just impossible. How much crime will various types of developments bring and cost us? We could build 300 or 400 houses, not have a problem at all, have one particular apartment building, for example, that costs us 4 officers to be there all the time. So it's so difficult to figure out. We've tried to make some guesses at it. From the city planning point of view, and I want to get Libby and Rob involved in the discussion, but there's a fairly obvious growth boundary for us of what we can do in terms of infill before we have huge infrastructure costs. And that boundary is generally the boundary that's served by the sanitary district presently with interceptors. And beyond that, then we're into big infrastructure costs, more roads, more sewers. But we're probably, I don't know, I think Libby and Bill, I think we're probably 1,500, 2,000 home lots away from that consideration, at least on that particular point. that's really tough, and if we could figure out a way to do it, we could sell it everywhere.
That particular boundary is reflected in our comprehensive plan,
Right.
so, I mean, that's useful to look at. Okay, those are all my questions for now.
I mean, I wish we
Yeah.
could do that, and if we could figure out how to do that, it would be great.
Well, it's kind of the question of, we have this growth boundary, what percentage build-out do we have to hit that?
Right.
I mean, how much infill development can we take? Are we 70% the way there, 80% the way there? I mean, in terms of these long-term projections of when we need to add interceptors and et cetera.
Well, we need to start planning in a very preliminary way for that. We need to plan not only where it needs to go a decade from now. It could be 7 years, maybe it's 15 years from now, I don't know. Where those things need to go, and we actually have set aside some money for to start studying, interceptors and that type of thing. Part of it is the pace of development. What's going to happen with interest rates. Are there willing sellers? Urbana for so many years was handicapped by the fact that we had large areas that were not for sale and couldn't be developed, that were served by roads, served within our service areas, and served by sewers. It was a very difficult situation. So a lot of factors there, but we'll work on it.
Okay. Dennis?
Just kind of a quick one on, if you were actually to compend a report about the timetable in which certain abated taxes would be coming back to the city due to the attrition of the 10-year time frame. I guess I've always had this question about the Build Urbana property tax abatement for individual home buyers, which is based on the fact that the property taxes in Urbana were higher than those in Champaign. But if now they're deemed to be basically even, I guess it'd be something that I would wonder about, the length and the duration of the continuance of the program. And I don't recall whether it was a 5 or 7 year time frame in which those property owners were eligible to avoid the taxes, and that maybe there'd be, since there were supposedly 700 starts, or I can't remember the number of houses that came in out of the program in the last 2 years, would we be looking in about 5 years of a large income from those going back on the rolls?
Well, a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, the ordinance that was approved by the previous city council runs for about 18 more months, I believe. And during that period of time, homes built within that period would get the 5 years equalization. The equalization is based upon the Champaign tax rate. As far as income, this is a little bit tricky, but keep in mind our tax rate at the city of Urbana and the tax rate at the city of Champaign is equal. So the difference comes not for what money we will see, it's really related to the park district and the school district. So there's where, in the township, and there's where the difference in the taxes lies. So, as it stands now, we've got that sunsets in 18 months, something like that. Probably will coincide with a huge increase in interest rates or something, and we'll have an end to this anyway. But but anything built during that period of time, unless changed, would receive that benefit. We can calculate exactly what that is, and we have that information, and we know exactly where they are in that process, and where that basically benefits the other taxing districts.
And not the city so much, but the other ones that are less equalized. Okay.
Yeah, the tax rate this year was only about 10% difference, so the rebate's going to be 10%. So, but even the 5 years that the rebate goes, all the government entities got a 4 to 5 to 1 payback for every dollar they had to pay in the rebate. They got $4 or $5 out of it because they're still getting all the. They're just losing the difference. They're still getting almost all their taxes from the new homes. All they're losing is the difference between, which is the 10%, which is a small amount. And then, of course, after the 5 years, they don't even have to pay the rebate anymore. So, and whether that's a good program or not, is probably an individual thing. But I'm always amazed, since I have to communicate with a lot of the people that or on the builder ban, at least psychologically, whether it's truly enough money to make people change their habits or not, psychologically, I can tell you it is. Because they, in the tax bills hit, I probably had 40 or 50 phone calls. How do I get my rebate? Even though maybe it's not a large amount of money, it certainly wouldn't be enough for me to probably buy a home one place or another. But to some people, at least psychologically, it's a very important factor. At least that's my opinion.
We have compiled a fairly significant amount of information on that program, and I'll be providing that to the mayor very shortly.
That's cool.
Other questions from committee members? Charlie?
One last one then. The Community Development Sync Fund, could this conceivably be used to help fund the shortfall for Women's Center, Women's Place, and the other two agencies that are
It would be a
lacking
policy,
funding?
certainly a policy decision of the council on how to use that sync fund. I mean, it was set up, there's some reasons documented here that it was set up. But the bottom line is that the sync fund was created with general fund sources, so it's not limited by HUD restrictions. So it's just like a reserve fund. So to answer your question, it could be used for anything that the council deems it appropriate in technical terms. We may or may not be consistent with previous policy that the councils have set, but that's the answer.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Bruce and your staff for preparing this. It was
Yeah,
very
well,
thorough.
everybody, Ron, everybody's put a lot of work into that. The next one is a lot of work, too. Do we want to...
Would committee members like a 2-minute break, and then we reconvene and hear the presentation of the capital improvement plan? Does anyone have any concerns with doing that? Just, we've been going for 2 hours, so.
I would agree with that idea.
Okay. So we'll,
Would there, since there are some other order of business, and we have people out here for that, is there any benefit to switching that around for the folks that are out there or not?
okay.
I mean, just a thought. I don't know whether it's possible.
For these other things.
How many folks are here for other items on the agenda? Okay.
Why don't we do
Two.
those two real quickly if we can, if there's no...
Okay. Could you're with, let's see, DSC and, excuse me, and Carl? Do committee members have any objections to moving the, let's see, number 9 and number 10 to after number 6, and then have a short bathroom break and come back for a CIP? Okay, there are no concerns about that? In that case, we will, if we could, we'll do number 9 next. So next we have ordinance number 2005-05-064, an ordinance approving a third amendment to a City of Urbana Community Development Block Grant Subrecipient Agreement. This refers to the Disabled Citizens Foundation. We do have a representative from that organization who said he could answer questions as well. We'll hear from staff first.
Okay, and here from Developmental Services is Dale Morrissey. This is the third amendment to a subrecipient agreement back from 03-04, and essentially what it does is it changes location of the project that was funded previously. The project's an employment training center, and previously this was going to be located at their current campus, and subsequently staff at the agency have found a more suitable location. I believe that's on Clark Street. The amendment would also change the term of the agreement, and so it would extend to March 31, 2006, and that would allow them time to close on the property and to make the renovation changes that would be necessary. Just a little bit of the background in terms of fiscal impacts. We've met our timeliness test for CDBG this May, and we give kind of a heads up for future projects that will need to be more concerned about timeline extensions, especially for large capital projects for CDBG. It's about 3 years ago that HUD introduced the timeliness tests, and we've come rather close on some occasions. So we need to work a little harder in reviewing applications to determine readiness and to look for more set timelines so that we can plan ahead for those timeliness tests. Let's see. The Community Development Commission reviewed the amendment on April 22nd and recommended approval by a 6-0 vote. And we have attached the ordinance for the amendment, the original agreement, and 2 previous amendments to the agreement. Any questions?
Questions from committee members? If not, I'd entertain a motion.
So moved.
I second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That carries. Thank you. Next, we have ordinance number 2005-05-065. This is an ordinance partially vacating an alley referring to east of Lincoln between Church Street and Park Street. We'll hear from Bill Gray on this.
Madam Chair.
Oh, go ahead.
I need to disclose that I have a conflict of interest on this matter, and so I will therefore recuse myself and also, of course, abstain from any voting. In fact, I'm going to leave my chair.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Lynn. Bill?
Thank you. We've been approached by Carl Foundation of a desire to have a part of an alley vacated, and this is south and east of the intersection of Lincoln Avenue and Church Street, north of Park Street, and this is for a proposed development of a spinal center that would go in at this location, and the footprint of the development would include a building and a parking lot in this location, and to help with the development would be this alley vacation. City Council has passed by previous resolution these sorts of matters, how they're handled, and one important criteria is will there be an adverse impact to the balance of the area if we were to vacate part of the alley. And attached in this packet is a petition that says that the remaining property owners, including Carl, are in favor, let me restate it, are okay with the partial alley vacation, that access to their properties can be from Busey Avenue. A second matter that comes up when alleys or streets are vacated is if it's in a non-residential area or a property owner or zoning, that there's usually a value, an appraised value for that land. In this particular case, there's a trade of properties, if you will. The city has a long-term desire to have a signalized intersection at Church Street and Lincoln Avenue, which would include turn lanes. We don't currently have sufficient right-of-way there to do that. So what we're requesting in lieu of an exchange of the alley vacation would be a dedication of privately owned land to the city for that future project. So the exact areas are not equivalent, but I wanted to make a point that Carl, at their sole expense, has also done a public-related improvement, and that is there's an alley 1 block south of here that they paved and improved at their expense, no city expense, for their properties and some private properties in that block too. So it's staff's recommendation that there would not be any money exchange, but it would be merely a land exchange, and this is agreeable to the Carl representatives. So included in your packet is the partial alley vacation, and then I, for information purposes, included the right-of-way dedication. And then there's an ordinance, of course, that would allow such a partial alley vacation to occur. So if there are any questions.
Questions from committee members. Dennis.
To explain the future use of this block that's bisected by the east-west alley by Carl, can you tell me a little bit about what's going to happen to these homes? Are they going to be leveled and there's going to be a new building placed on this site? Is that correct?
Yes.
It's not indicated here, but I'm just guessing this is what's going to happen.
Some homes have already been removed now at this corner.
Okay. So all of the homes in the green area are actually owned by Carl, and they're all being leveled, and a new building will be placed there? The green outlines, well, I guess including from Church Street to Park Street, north and south?
I believe there's an exception. I believe there's a property on Park Street that Mr. Manzer's here from Carl, and he could address that question.
Sounds like the man to ask.
Yeah, right. Andy Manzer.
Good evening. There is a corner property at the corner of Lincoln and Park that we do not own, and that home will remain.
Serious?
That's correct, Mr. Griffith's home.
Okay. And my concern, I guess, and since I didn't know, was that this one particular house or garage can be accessed only by the alley, and, point 4 of the vacanting an alley is that you have to consider with anybody would be disposed of being able to access the property. So my understanding
that home is not impacted by the alley, though.
This one is not, but the access to
the northeast corner of Park and Lincoln Avenue. Okay, that home has access off Lincoln directly.
Yes, I'm not concerned about that house.
Oh, okay.
It was a different house. It's the second house on the alley that I indicated as orange here on my map.
That was a Carl-owned property.
It was, and so that's taken care of. It's not a private property.
Correct.
Okay.
Are you finished?
Yeah, that was the only problem I saw with the plan.
Other questions?
What's the footprint of the building that's going up in place of this?
The building will be focused on the corner of Church and University. It is a 17,000 square foot footprint. The building will be a slab-on-grade structure. Will be initially a single structure, a two-story facade on the front, and we are building in structurally the ability to go up to a third floor for future expansion.
Church and University.
Well, I'm sorry, it'd be Lincoln and Church, southeast corner.
And the building will be positioned on University. The parking will be behind the building, and so it will be to the east and to the south of the structure. So focused behind the building and towards Park Street will be the parking.
So what happens down in here?
What will be occurring on the north side of Park Street?
Yes.
What will be on the north side of Park Street? Will there be parking?
North of Park Street will be parking, and then the building and the further to the top of the block.
So it's parking here and building here. What happens in here then? I guess what happens in the southeast corner of the property that's on Park Street?
The homes that are there to the right of the corner home will all be demoed.
Oh, okay.
And they are all owned by Carl.
So does that all become parking then?
Yes, it does. Parking to support the building. Yes, that will be.
Charlie, did you have another question?
No, I'm just trying to picture exactly what's happening.
I have a question, which is the houses on just to the south of Church Street, are they currently occupied, or are they even standing at this point?
No, they're not occupied, and all but one has been demoed at this point.
Okay, and that one won't be occupied in the future?
Correct.
Okay. Just a question for Mr. Ray. Will we see a plat for this project?
I don't know if there's any zoning. Is this going to be?
I mean, it functions as a zoning law, it's sort of an option for them to be plat and light.
It's in the MIC, the Medical
Right.
Institutional Campus, so it's within it's appropriate for the zoning, but the question is whether or not we would see a plat, and you're saying maybe.
Well, I think they can build it without replanting since they own all the lots. It becomes a zoning lot.
Okay.
So the question is, for convenience, do they want to clean up the lot lines? In that case, you might see a subdivision doing that.
Okay. Other questions? If not, the chair would entertain a motion.
I move that we accept the ordinance proposal as stated.
Are you moving it to council?
To council.
With the
Move to
recommendation
council
for
with
approval?
recommendation of approval.
Okay, we have a motion. Is there a second? We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That carries. Thank you very much. And next, I'm going to call a 5-minute recess.
Oh, Dan, someone brings this up.
Two things before we get started with the capital improvement plan. First off, Mayor Pressing wasn't feeling well. She had to retire for the evening. And second, this memo that I'm going to be passing out now is from Libby Tyler. It's basically a memo that relates to our social service funding, and we'll be having the 2 meetings tomorrow and the next day. So go ahead and give this a read tonight or tomorrow before we come to the meeting. And with that, we'll jump on to the capital improvement plan presentation. Mr. Gray?
Thank you. Just like to make a few opening comments, but first I'd like to introduce two key players in the Public Works Engineering Division responsible for this document, and Assistant City Engineer is Gail Jamison, and next to him is Doug Miller, our Projects Coordinator, and Doug spends a lot of time in working and putting this document together. A couple of comments. First of all, the capital improvement plan is our, no pun intended, roadmap to the future. In projects, construction projects, there's a long lead time to look at their surveying and design and construction, and many times there's right-of-way or easements to be acquired, and there's other variables that can occur, utility relocations and such. So we do need lead time to make them happen in the construction season that we're shooting for. So literally, tonight's discussions and future discussions on the capital improvement plan really aren't about construction in 2005. In fact, in this document, we're telling you or showing you that this is the construction for 2005. Those decisions have already been made. So really what we're looking at is what may happen as early as this fall, but really in 2006, 2007. There are just some things taking long lead time. For example, there's a multi-million-dollar project for Windsor Road between High Cross Road and Filo Road. I mean, that's targeted for FY 08 and 09. So, and yet we're already working on that now in working with the consultant, because there's long lead time for those sorts of projects. So I wanted to give you that information. Secondly, I'm very proud of our engineering division. It's really a full-service consulting firm, quite frankly. We have drafters, technicians, surveyors, engineers. We literally do the work that many consulting firms in town do. So as a result, we do as much as we can with construction management and design in-house. However, there are times, depending on the project, that we do have to get additional help. It may be just because our workload is such a level, or there's a certain expertise that is needed that we don't have in-house that we have to consult or contract out. So what you have in this document is, in fact, a lot of the work is done by in-house staff. And quite frankly, that is a savings of, in contrast, you'd be paying 2 to 3 times the costs, if you will, if you were consulting, such fees out. So I wanted you to have that general understanding. So that is an introduction. I will hand it off, and Doug will go through the highlights.
First of all, I'd like to say that this document includes a huge amount of information. I do not plan on going over all those items in detail tonight. I thought that I would take about 15 or 20 minutes and give you an overview of the capital improvement plan, a little brief history of the process from which the plan evolved, and go over the high points and see if you have any initial questions. My plan was to come back in 2 weeks after you've had some time to absorb the information and have time to review it and go over the information in more detail, unless you'd like to go into more detail tonight, and then at that time answer further questions. A little bit of explanation of the capital improvement, I'd say the intent of the plan is to produce a comprehensive, long-range plan for the maintenance and extension of city-owned infrastructure. The infrastructure included here are streets and street maintenance, street improvements, sanitary and storm sewers, traffic signals, bridges, curb and gutter, parking lots, bike paths, sidewalks, and so forth. There are a few categories of infrastructure that are not included, and that would be buildings, which is probably the main one, the LRC site, the landfill, the wood site, which is a site that we store construction materials on the north side of the saline ditch, which is north of the landfill and LRC site. All those categories of infrastructure plus the city-owned vehicles are your major capital assets the city owns and manages. The basis of the plan is to identify, prioritize, coordinate, and schedule projects within revenue availability and restrictions and within council policies. The reason I mention restrictions on the revenue is because some funds that we deal with are restricted in their use. In an example, you can't use the sewer benefit tax to replace street lighting. Also, another point on the funding, I think it's a major point, and probably in our financial planning, is that most projects are paid for on a cash basis. In other words, we borrow very little, which does not get us committed down the road to huge projects, which may or may not be at the time in 5 or 10 years down the road be the most priority of the city. Sometimes we do have to borrow on some items, and usually that whatever that borrowing is, there's a dedicated revenue source to pay that borrowing back. So the purpose for this capital improvement plan is to construct projects in the most effective and efficient way possible through the collection of all this data. Historically, this process started in the early 1980s when there were many major infrastructure needs that the city was preparing to address. Some of those needs were sanitary sewers, storm sewers because of street flooding, street lighting replacement, concrete sidewalk maintenance, etc. Since the revenues were limited, as they always are, it was determined that the city would like to create an inventory and review all the potential needs and all the infrastructure categories that are included in the plan. We did that, and once these were listed and reviewed and the needs identified, we presented to the council at the time several different options which were based on different revenue levels, which then gets you different levels of project completion. The council at the time chose a certain option, and in addition to the existing funding that was available, added some funding from the local sales tax that had just been passed at the time, plus started the sewer benefit tax fund, which is mostly dedicated for sanitary sewer construction. Over the years, which is 17 years, we've completed many projects, and we've also added many additional projects that have been identified over the last few years. Again, we do pack a lot of information into the document. At this time, I'd like to turn to the document and go over the information that is included briefly. The first piece of information is a memo, summary memo, transmittal memo, that discusses and summarizes many of the major aspects and projects included in the draft of the capital improvement plan. There, towards the end of that, right before page 1 of the plan, there's a resolution approving the draft of the resolution approving the capital improvement plan for 2005. This is included as a standard operating procedure. We've included that. It's been adopted, I believe, most of the past 17 years. There may have been 1 or 2 years that was delayed or not passed. There's really no deadline for passing that resolution. The only thing that's really time-sensitive are the projects that are included in the proposed FY06 budget, which we'll get to those in a little bit. The next page in the plan, the table of contents, I think shows the wide range of information that's included in the plan. You can go to this document and look at where the streets are, where the city limits are, where the TIF boundaries are, where what the street surfaces are, where sidewalks exist, where sidewalks don't exist, and so forth. So there's a lot of information in this document that's made available to you, basic information.
I could interject. If there's one document you don't throw out in your years of office here, it's this one, because 1 year from now, 4 years from now, you're going to get questions, and you'll have the ready answer literally in this document.
The next two, the next two items in the capital improvement plan, the project list and the cash flow, are probably the heart of the plan, and I'd like to come back to those in a few minutes. After the project list and the cash flow, you'll find a number of maps. We try to put as much information together in a visual map so it's easy to read and quick to read. The first three maps in here are construction maps. 2004 construction map is a map that we've added this year. Normally we wouldn't publish a project or a construction map from the previous year, but I think it's good information and it kind of gives you a point of reference. The next two maps, as Bill mentioned, go into the projects proposed in 2005 and 2006. Many of the projects in 2005 are already underway or in some phase of design and bid letting. And I'll come back to those 2005 and 2000 maps in a minute also. After the construction maps, and in kind of a more long-range perspective, we have Figure A, which shows sewer projects that have been identified in the inventory that we've taken, and the projects that are projected in the 10-year plan are highlighted in yellow on this figure. The next figure I'd like to mention is Figure C. Figure C on page 39. Has everybody got that? Figure C shows all the major street work, traffic signals that are proposed, or projected, I should say, in the next 10 years in the city. It's a very comprehensive map. If you're looking for information on a certain street, when it's going to be, if it's going to be overlaid, reconstructed, whether a traffic signal is projected in the next 10 years, this would be a good map to look at to see if that street is in the projections and for what type of construction. The bike paths are also included on here. However, going on to Figure R, which is towards the back of the maps, we show existing city bike path system, and also on this map we show projected projects in the next 10 years. A note on this map in particular, this map shows the city bike path system and projected projects in the city bike path system. There are several projects that we've added to the map this year because of two reasons. One is to make more logical connections between segments that had already been projected, and also to add some projects that it seems like when any of the major arterial collectors are being constructed, a bike path is also being planned or proposed on that street section. So we have added bike paths on all the major arterials and collectors that are projected, or most of them that are projected in the next 10 years. The last general comment is that all the information in this document is dynamic, and we have new information that comes up every year. Funding levels change, project priorities change. The council directed at the time that we passed the capital improvement plan to update this annually. It's a good idea to do that, to make sure that you're coordinating all the new information with the old information. I did forget to mention, excuse me, the matrices, the priority matrices in the back. We do have a written procedure to determine priorities of street resurfacing, existing traffic signals, modernization, proposed new traffic signals. All those are graded in a matrix based on criteria and point values, and all that is a written procedure. Going back to the 2005 project list, which is page 1 of the document, this list has 2 years of projects for reference. It also includes a project list on pages 8 and 9 for fiscal year 05-06. The information presented here includes all projects and programs that are related to this infrastructure, and they're included in, I believe it's 7 different funds, maybe more than that. It's Capital Improvement Fund, the Motor Fuel Tax Fund, the Sewer Benefit Tax Fund, the 4 TIF district funds, the MVPS system, and Community Development Block Grant. Now, other than, there's also programs included on here which are in the several of those funds' budgets, such as brick sidewalk programs and tree planting programs, which are general annual programs that are addressed in the capital improvement plan. The cash flow, which is on page, starts on page 22, is a different breakdown of all the projects. It's broken down by the different funds. The Sewer Benefit Tax Fund, Motor Fuel Tax Fund, and Capital Improvement Fund have all the expenditures that you will see in the budget shown in this document. The main item that you might want to focus on is the FY06 column, which is the 4th column over from the right from the descriptive column. Those columns in Sewer Benefit Tax, the Motor Fuel Tax, and the Capital Improvement Fund should be, if not exactly the same as what you'll find in the budget, will be really close. The other funds, the TIF funds and MVPS and Community Development Block Grant funds, only show the expenditures related to these categories of infrastructure. There's a lot of other expenditures in those funds that are not listed in this cash flow. If you go back to, just as pulling out one project as an example of what the capital improvement plan is, the intent and is about, on page 8 in the project list, if you go down to Green Street from Vine to Glover, this is page 8 in the project list, and these are alphabetical, and Green Street is listed just about the middle of page 8 from Vine to Glover. You'll see that there's projected resurfacing a new curb and gutter is a description of the project on that section of Green Street. It's projected in the 2006 construction year. The next, I think, 10 columns break down any expenditures on different types of infrastructure on that street. This street in particular has multiple entries because there's several elements that are being addressed. The first element, sanitary sewers, we're planning on $110,000 in the sanitary sewer repairs. Excuse me. The second, the street maintenance, would be the resurfacing of the street, $140,000. There's also another $100,000, I think, proposed in FY07. There's $100,000 in storm sewers, repairs and improvements, $210,000 for curb and gutter replacement, and then the amount is totaled in the total estimated cost column. The sewer benefit tax is paying $110,000, and the rest of the costs are coming out of the motor fuel tax. The example that I picked this as an example because one of the intents of the capital improvement plan is to coordinate all those different improvements and repairs to the infrastructure so that we don't wind up resurfacing a street, say, in 2006, and 2007 or 8, find out that we got a sanitary sewer that needs to be repaired, or storm sewer is under capacity, or whatever the scenario might be. So we try to do this in a comprehensive way, identify all the projects so everything's interrelated, the funding's interrelated. So we need to keep abreast of all our project needs in these different infrastructures and on our funding, and project those out and do a planning document such as this. Going to the construction maps, which is the last item I wanted to review before questions. Bill alluded to this a little bit, but just to kind of high point the things that are coming up, the major things that are coming up, try to get out of some of the detail. But in the 2005 construction map, probably the number one project, the biggest project that's coming up is the Linderman Avenue Improvement Project between Washington and Main Street. This is a joint county and city project. It involves improving the street to a concrete street, installation of street lighting, a bike path on the east side, a sidewalk on the west side, storm sewer improvements. That's the biggest project that's coming up. The second largest is probably pavement maintenance on Florida Avenue and on Race Street, which are towards the bottom lower section of the map. Third largest project is probably the Stone Creek Bike Path. That project is in a design phase. We have received a grant from the Department of Natural Resources for $152,000 to go towards that path, and design's almost complete. Is that correct, Gail? And that project should be going to bid this month or next. The next project is Sunset Avenue Improvement. Is a joint project with Community Development Block Grant and other 809 monies for storm sewers and pavement maintenance. It is south of Bradley Avenue, north of Fairview from Lincoln to Kohler. The next project, Goodwin Avenue Bike Path, over to the left on the map, running roughly from Bradley down to Springfield, is already under construction. We also have a grant for that for 80% of the construction from, at least from Bradley down to University Avenue from the federal government. It's enhancement funding. The next project is probably brick sidewalks, repair and reconstruction in the Leal School area. The only other item that I'd like, there's many other miscellaneous projects that are shown here, storm and sanitary sewer projects, but the other item, general item I'd like to mention, and something we've added this year is that we've shown projects that are under design in the dashed blue line. Those projects, we have some streetscape and on University Avenue and Race Street and Broadway, and some the Boneyard improvement. I anticipate to start in the next fiscal year for just more concept designs, trying to identify what the needs are and what direction we want to go with those projects. There's also the Lincoln Avenue project from Green Street to Delaware Avenue, and the Colorado and Philo Road projects, and also Bill already mentioned the Windsor Road project. On the 2006 construction map, it shows projects that are, some of which have already had some funding passed in the previous budget, which will have additional funding coming up. Probably the largest project on here will be the Lincoln Avenue project between California and Delaware, with the installation of 2 traffic signals, one at Nevada and one at Pennsylvania. The University of Illinois will be participating in the cost of those 2 traffic signal installations. Probably the next biggest project is the Green Street project, which we talked about. Well, I take that back. Probably the next biggest project is Philo Road project. It's estimated at $1.2 million, with $600,000 of that in FAU funds. And you have other projects, Colorado widening and extension over the Prairie Wind subdivision, some other resurfacing projects, and again, some design and projects continuing, and additional brick sidewalks north of Previta Hospital. So with that, I thought I would take any questions you might have about this, unless you want to go into anything in more detail. I thought I'd take any questions at this time.
Let's take a question from committee members. Lynn?
I have a couple quick questions. Does exchanging the light posts when they get rusted out, is that included in this kind of a plan? So
Yes.
when it says lighting, I mean, I see stop lights and I see series lighting replacement, and so what is the phrase when you change that, when you change the posts?
The street lighting modernization project,
That's the phrase for,
that would be a phrase we would use, yeah, for removing the series lighting and replacing it with new street lighting with parallel circuits.
Okay.
So we still have couple large areas to go, and one is in the Yankee Ridge School area.
right.
Another area, as mentioned, is Lincoln Avenue, and then on campus. So those are series streetlight areas that still need to be addressed.
And they aren't really, they aren't addressed in the near future.
Correct. Well, Lincoln Avenue is in 06.
Is, but not the Yankee Ridge.
Most of them are, I think, in the next couple of years, or in the cash flow for the next couple of years as far as campus. There are some things we need to work out with the university on the campus lighting, and then I think the Yankee Ridge, I think it's probably about a 2-year window, 2 to 3 year window out, but there are funds proposed, and maybe funds in FY06.
While he's looking that up, we did decide and made a fairly significant decision, it's been 5 or 6 years ago, I guess, to replace all of the series street lighting in the city of Urbana. We have a couple years to go on that, and that's to replace what we had, and those were the old series type, like the old Christmas trees, so we go to a parallel circuit. But with the exception of the university area, which is still a little bit up in the air, west of Lincoln Avenue, we should be hitting all of that in the next couple of years, with the exception of deciding if we want to add on for intersections, which is sort of an add-on. So, that was a major decision, capital improvement decision made by the city council. We did that without a tax increase. If you'll remember, there's quite a big story in Champaign because they were charging residents for that. We made the decision that was part of your property tax and that we were going to replace it over time. And that was a significant decision that was made by previous council members.
The other quick question I have is, there are basically curbs, streets with curbs and gutters, and then there are oil and chip streets with no curbs and gutters.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then is there any third type?
Is there a third type?
Yeah.
There are some streets that have asphalt without curb and gutter.
For example, George Huff.
Yes.
In that area.
Yes.
Okay, so that's asphalt with no curbs and gutter.
Right. Ideally, in urban areas, you want curb and gutter with storm sewers and without ditches, but we do have many chip and seal streets in town with ditches or ill-defined ditches.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Is there a criteria for moving on those at some point in time?
There are, and through different years we have upgraded, depending on funding sources. We've used community development block grant monies to upgrade many chip and seal streets to concrete and streets, curb and gutter. In some years past, we had some neighborhood streets money that was used to upgrade some chip and seal streets just east of the city building with curb and gutter and asphalt overlay. Another option can be special assessments or establishment of special service areas where there's a cost sharing from residents and the city. There's a public benefit portion and city and resident participation. We have not had any recent such projects, but that's another means or mechanism to upgrade a chip and seal street to a improved concrete or asphalt street. Doug mentioned Sunset as an improvement this year in this construction season. We'll be taking bids on, I think, May 11th, in fact. Community development block grant monies are paying a large portion of that, along with some other funds, to change that to a reconstructed street.
Another question I had, have a lot of constituents asking questions about a clear, concise understanding of the brick sidewalks and the maintenance and repair of them. Is there a clear, concise?
Yes, excuse me. That program was recently initiated, I believe 2 years ago, with a major project. The area east of the city building was completed. The intent is to go through the whole city, review the condition of the brick sidewalks, and address them in either repair, reconstruction, or replacement. The plan has two areas and shows various blocks that are projected for construction or repair in the next 2 years. In addition to that, there's money projected every year for brick sidewalk repair or replacement. The current funding is and the last project that was done was significantly higher than what is projected after, I believe, FY06. What we have been doing, the first phase of this is trying to address the worst condition brick sidewalks in the city, and also address anything that we can that has special funding available for it. The area around Leo School would be funded by capital improvement plan monies. The area north of Pravina would be funded in large part by TIF monies because those blocks are in the TIF 3 financing district. So plan is to go through the whole city, address the worst of the area, whether those streets are, or whether those sidewalks are replaced, reconstructed, or repaired, depends on the existing condition of that section and also the funding availability. And one of the council policies and in the ordinance is each property owner has the option to, in some areas, there is an option to replace the brick sidewalks with concrete. In other areas, there is no option. It has to be replaced in brick. So there's a lot of various details that have to be worked out before you could determine what's going to happen on a certain block.
Does the same apply for the street?
Pardon me?
Does the same criteria apply to the street itself?
The street itself, in a general sense, yes, it's the street improvement would be addressed, or street maintenance would be addressed in a similar way. The highest priorities would be done first. They're limited based on what funding is available in different areas. And if you're referring back to the oil and chip streets and the curb and gutter, that would also be and it's in the original ordinance resolution that the council passed as far as direction of the payment of that. The priorities of the council as far as how many of those oil and chip streets are done compared in relation to street maintenance and so forth. Currently, there's several oil and chip streets that are in the 10-year list. Unfortunately, there are probably 10 miles or more left of those oil and chip streets without curb and gutters. We are trying to upgrade those as much as possible with drainage improvements. We are looking at some of the streets in the city. Brad Bennett, our storm sewer engineer, and I've been coordinating with Jim Kelly, our operations supervisor, on trying to upgrade those a little bit to at least get them to either a micro-paved surface, which eliminates the oil and rock on those streets. But again, doing all the curb and gutter on those local streets is a large need in the city that we don't have the funding, at least at this point, to address all of them in the next 10 years.
Okay. Did you have other questions? Okay. Dennis?
Well, of course, Robert's question echoes in my mind because, of course, I've been interested in the project for sidewalk repair, brick sidewalk repair. And looking at the funding, and I realize that certain areas of town have been treated to larger attention than others in certain sections of neighborhoods. And you've explained that in some areas you have grant money, in some areas it's a TIF district, in some areas it's a census tract such and such, and there's various considerations. To what degree are individual ward people living in these areas able to communicate with you preferences of the neighborhoods, or, question some of the choices that have been made? Since I see that if the marks appear now on the map, does that mean that these decisions are set and these are what is been funded? Or are these things still fluid?
I think whenever residents anywhere in the city have questions like that, they should bring those to my attention, and we would address that. And quite frankly, we welcome that kind of feedback and inputs. We think we have a pretty good handle globally as to the condition of the infrastructure in the city, but we don't see everything nearly as well as the 50 feet in front of someone's home. Okay, so I think that's important information to have. But as far as the line on the map, so to speak, again, for 2005, that line is set in concrete. But it doesn't mean that for 2006, 7, and beyond, we don't consider other things too. So
I think I'm thinking about the future, and wishing to be more participatory and looking at how some things are decided. Mm-hmm. That's all.
This capital improvement plan has not been voted on yet. That's my understanding. It's up for discussion. Mm-hmm. We're in the process of moving it through the discussion, understanding process, and at some point we vote on it. At that point, motions would be appropriate to change it, and I would recommend to committee members, before making motions, to speak to staff members and engineers about proposals or suggestions you have for moving timelines around, or potentially adding things to the radar, et cetera. So we have some time to speak to staff about that.
It's excellent.
Any other questions?
I have
Go ahead, Charlie.
I have a list.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Charlie's list.
Charlie's list, yeah. Five questions here, basically. Page 9 shows revenues exceed costs by about $1 million. Is that sort of standard operating procedure for expected overruns, or is it?
Page 9, the project list?
Yeah, the project list.
Revenues.
Yeah, I've got revenues at 8.17 million and costs for the total estimated costs at 7.1. So,
one of the details on this is that to identify all the funds, or some of these funds in the right-hand column are double entries.
Ah, okay.
If you'll see on page 9, take for instance the series lighting replacement. The funding for that, to make the budget, at the direction of the council, to make the budget or make the funding coincide with the project list, you have to show money coming into AL9 from other sources. So it'll be shown in AL9, but I also have an entry in the fifth column showing where that money is coming from. And if you go back to the cash flow, you'll see that money's coming in from MVPS and the U of I, the $400,000. So that would be a number that you would have to reduce the total revenue by.
A09 incidentally is capital replacement and improvement revenue, so.
Yeah. Same thing would happen with FAU funds. They would be coming into motor fuel tax and going out, but I'll have a note as to those additional funds.
Yeah, so that accounts for $1 million right there, 600 and 400, basically. Okay.
Basically, as the revenues and the sewer benefit tax and motor fuel tax, community development block grant, and the capital improvement and replacement fund columns should coincide with the cash flows in the cash flow behind the project list.
Okay, thank you. One of the big concerns I have is the order of priority for Washington, Florida, and Olympian Drive. I'm concerned that with the construction of Walmart and Aldi's, that there'll be a lot of pressure on Washington Avenue immediately. You've got a 4-lane road basically from Philo to Pfeiffer, right, and then it collapses down to a 2-lane, basically oil and chip, I think. You're talking about putting micro slurry coating on that, I think, and it shows a couple of times being done. I'm concerned that there'll be a bottleneck there. It'll be a very popular route, and we're just going to collapsing down to 2 lanes there. And the traffic impact on that very poor street. I ride my bike out that way all the time, and that road's not going to hold up.
Well, I think part of the dynamics here is if and when Florida Avenue gets extended to High Cross. If Florida Avenue is extended, then that would certainly relieve a lot of pressure on Washington Street. But if for some reason Florida Avenue doesn't get extended, then that's going to put more pressure on Washington, and we may have to revise things accordingly.
Well, my feeling is that there's going to be immediate pressure on Washington, regardless of what happens on Florida.
We've done some traffic projections as part of the Walmart project, and what will be probably the most noticeable was probably the needs for signals at High Cross in Washington. I think the 2 lanes will hold up fine outside of the maintenance of the road itself. We're not pushing 4 lanes in the near term at all.
Okay, so you're going to have a crew out there every other week to patch the potholes.
If need be. I mean, there have been sometimes you run into those situations, with changes in the truck traffic or what have you. We've had those circumstances before. So, but again, this is our best projections here for Florida. Florida is a key.
Okay. Yeah, I don't disagree with the timing on Florida. I agree completely that it's a high priority extension, but I just worry about having Washington be 7 years out past that. I see it maybe on par with the extension of Florida. I'm also concerned with where Olympian Drive comes into play. Maybe projects will come along that will just fund that much sooner or something like that. But we potentially could have 3 major roadways all hitting at the same time.
Well, Olympian is a concern. There's kind of a long answer to that, but I'll try to make it short. And the short version is that Olympian is one of those projects that absolutely requires federal funding, Surface Transportation Program monies. And if any of you have heard, the federal government postponed any decision on reauthorizing the highway bill. So that's still in a state of limbo. But anyway, the projects facing the Champaign-Urbana Savoy area as a whole are 3 projects. One is Windsor Road, Curtis Road, and Olympian. And the federal dollars next year are being targeted for Curtis Road in the vicinity of Duncan and Staley for the interchange. Then in 08-09, there's money targeted for Windsor Road between High Cross and Fievel Road. After that, decisions have to be made as to where federal dollars will be spent, but there's a lot of emphasis on continued work on Curtis Road. So the amount of, at this point, as far as we know, the federal dollars coming to Champaign-Urbana-Savoy are about $1 million a year, and typically that's a 50% funding. The balance of monies needs to come from local participants, whether it's the county or the cities. And Curtis Road is multi-tens of thousands of dollars, and Olympian Drive is multi-tens of thousands of dollars. So you can do the math quickly and realize that you can save money for 20, 30 years, and that's what it's going to take to possibly do both of those types of projects. We're hopeful that through help with Representative Johnson, we may get $7 million to help jumpstart some of the Curtis Road work, and that would be helpful for everybody as far as doing Olympian sooner. But these are very costly projects, and the finite federal dollars that come our way just don't allow for all these projects to happen at one time. So as much as we'd like for Olympian or even Windsor to happen tomorrow, there is a waiting period for federal dollars to accumulate.
I guess this isn't the right place to debate the merits of doing anything at Curtis Road, but you know, this brings me to my next question, which is how is, if you look on the Figure G arterial and collector streets map, you know, the different colors, and talks about minor and major arterials. I'm having trouble seeing Windsor as a minor arterial equivalent to Curtis Road when Windsor has 4 lanes and Curtis is a pothole-strewn country road. Yet they're both labeled as minor arterials. How does that work?
Well, definitions of arterial collector and local are this. Arterial roads, whether they're 2 lanes or 6 lanes, are basically facilities that traverse your community, and typically, you know, they termini, if they do at all, with other arterial roads, and their traffic volumes can be 10, 20, 30,000 cars a day. To give you an example, sure, Curtis Road today is a chip and seal highway, along with High Cross Road to the north, or Staley Road to the west in Champaign, but there's certain classifications for planning purposes that you define and classify these roads so that you reserve the proper right-of-way in those corridors, that you control access to those roads so that they function according to their designation. A collector street is a street that doesn't have quite the significance of an arterial. Its lengths and importance are diminished, but at the same time, they're typically taking pockets of areas, subdivisions and whatnot, and try to funnel traffic to those locales. And those are streets that are typically more in the 5,000 to 10,000 cars a day. These priorities, incidentally, are also how we prioritize, for example, snow removal or street sweeping or other public works operations. There is a pecking order, if you will, based on the classification of our streets. So it's important when we do subdivisions, when we do planning, when we look at the comprehensive plan, how streets are classified play a very important role. So just the mere fact that a road is chip and seal and 2 lanes doesn't mean that it's a local street, which would be a local street maybe in front of your home or my home, but the arterial classification for Curtis, for example, we have had planning and scoping studies done, and we do know that we want a 150-foot right-of-way corridor through there. We do know that we don't want public street access points any greater than a 3rd mile or a 4th mile. And even Curtis Road, that is being improved in 06 in Champaign, is still a 2-lane facility. Full build-out in the south areas of Champaign, Urbana, Savoy someday may push it to 4 lanes. No different than Olympian Drive, or in this case, Windsor Road, we have is 4 lanes today because of the traffic volumes we've seen.
Okay, a little more mundane item. I see that Lot 25, parking Lot 25 is expanding. Is that,
Yes.
is that, what land is being used for that? Is that?
It's city-owned property. It's just north of the single-room occupancy facility there on Griggs, and it's actually an extension of the existing Lot 25, which serves Silver Creek and other businesses, and that's to help offset parking loss with the Stratford development at Water and Race.
Okay. And then, let's see, my last question is, if you look at the bike path maps, I'm having a little bit of trouble picturing the usefulness of some of them. Even, as a bicyclist, it seems almost like some of them are simply occurring because there are projects going on there. I don't know whether they really will be used by bicyclists. So how are you determining the real need for it, in one location versus another? Say North Cunningham, for example. You've got a bike path going all the way to, is it to Airport Road, or does it go beyond that?
That one in particular, I think there's been an identified need not only for the bike path, but for a pedestrian walkway, and that bike path plan would be to try to get a DNR grant to fund part of that, and in the TIF district fund the rest of it, and it would serve actually two purposes. A lot of the bike paths, the Department of Natural Resources likes to talk about them as a multi-purpose paths, and are looking at them as more recreational, multi-use. Enhanced with the federal government enhancement funding, we'll look at more as a transportation item and looking at just the bicyclists. So a lot of these are actually probably multi-use paths that are proposed on here.
Okay, so your determination of where they're needed is actually based on some kind of study.
Yes, there's a Greenways, and most of these are projected in the Greenways and Trails, county-wide Greenways and Trails plan that was just adopted in the last couple of years. And there's some on here, as I mentioned, that we are projecting additional paths on some of the arterial collectors, which it seems like those are the most logical locations for extending our bike path system.
I guess I was a little concerned about connectivity. I guess there's no, I see some north-south. I see them to the east of the community, but none that seem to really work towards campus.
As far as into the campus, the Goodwin Avenue the main purpose of Goodwin Avenue is to connect the housing developments, apartment complexes on the Melrose and University Commons, I believe, to the campus.
That's one I like the most. I'm thinking in terms of east-west. Right?
And then the Green Street is a projected project that, as you noted, a lot of these are we'll also have street projects proposed in the next 10 years. Green Street will be another one that will be proposed for resurfacing and other construction. The exact route of that east-west connection is yet to be determined. Green Street, I think, is identified in various plans, comprehensive plan, the Greenways and Trails plan. Whether that's the best location needs to be reviewed in more detail. There may be other routes like Elm Street or Illinois Street or some other route, but some connection, east-west connection, is the main point of this, of showing that on this map. Another connection to the campus area is the Florida Avenue bike path that's shown running from Lincoln and Florida over through University property, over along Florida Avenue, and up towards the Aquatic Center. That connection, we already are coordinating with the Urbana Park District and the University of Illinois as far as exact location. In fact, in several of these, I've talked to the Park District for instance, about the one on North Broadway Avenue. So we are trying to make some connections to the U of I system. Of course, the Windsor Road already has a connection, although it's a shoulder path that connects into the university system. And then eventually Bradley Avenue is projected for an on-street path, and then the reconstruction of Bradley Avenue, which is north of the Goodwin Avenue bike path, is projected towards the end of the 10 years. And that connection would then get us into the Busey Wood paths and eventually into the connections in Country Club Road, Broadway.
I guess the one thing that I see missing is something right through the middle, say, between Washington from Philo to campus. There's just nothing in that sort of section. Everywhere else, there's north-south and east-west, but here's a major area where there's just nothing. It goes by the high schools and middle school. It goes by Carl Park, so on. There's a whole section there where there's nothing really identified, and I see a lot of bicyclists on Washington. It's a natural street for it. But you end up at the T intersection at Busey, which sort of, inhibits your movement.
I think just one reaction would be, number one, this is certainly good for further discussion for this map in general, but specifically in that area, I think part of what we've looked at, there's some constraints and well, there's some constraints in that you're trading off parking for paths, or you're going to be impacting trees and widening if it's on sidewalk areas and such. So those are constraints. But on the other hand, as I view bicyclists also that ride to campus, what one street would you want to pick? Because I literally see people use almost all of them.
Right.
So I don't know that we want to concentrate the bicycle traffic on just Nevada or whatever, just to pick a street out or something, or Michigan. But I think for the most part, the commuter in particular is on the street and using any one of those streets, to get to the university and then hop on one of the university paths or whatever. So there are some concerns with selecting a street and making a bike lanes or an off highway path, if you will, the constraints we have with right-of-ways or parking. So that's part of the dilemma we run into if we were to pursue that further, but not to negate, we couldn't discuss that.
I guess the best thing, pursuing that, I guess the best thing there is then those streets and how they intersect Lincoln and get you onto campus. Because that's the biggest problem, probably, is thinking along those lines, is getting across Lincoln onto campus. In a lot of those places, it's a bit tricky.
And we'll be signalizing a couple of intersections, which should help.
Madam Chairman?
Yes.
I think that the purpose of reviewing the capital improvement plan would be to get a general sense of how to understand and interpret the plan over the next couple of weeks in preparation for maybe voting on it. And perhaps we're getting a little too detailed in our questions about specific projects within the plan that might best be answered in other ways than right at this point of discussion. And I'm wondering if we could move things along to go back to the intent of the presentation, which is just a general overview of the plan.
One comment on the bike path issue is that this has been a recurring theme throughout, and I actually would recommend taking the conversation offline and up to 2 council members meeting with staff specifically about the issue of bike paths and talk. And I have a list of questions about that, but I think taking that particular discussion offline would be useful at this point. Let's have a conversation. Let's understand what these different level of bike paths are, et cetera. So I'd recommend that in terms of that discussion. Are there other specific questions? You can also, folks, feel free to contact staff via email or phone so we can continue conversations at that point. Okay. If not, was that the completion of your presentation on the CIP?
Yes, it is. I plan on, we'll be back in 2 weeks to go over things in more detail. I think some of the comments tonight are things that we are looking for, input. What are the council's priorities? Maybe there's a need that we haven't identified that needs to be included. We need to, and that's the point of preparing this every year and having it updated and reviewing it with council.
Okay. So committee members, if you have particular proposals, submit those to staff for feedback. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Okay, next, we're going to try to finish this up by 11 o'clock and not extend the meeting. So on number 11, we have ordinance number 2005-05-066.
We
did I
get to
jump?
number 8.
You're correct. Jumping back to number 8, thank you. We have ordinance number 2005-05-063, an ordinance annexing certain territory to the city of Urbana. This refers to 2907 East Main Street. Andrew and Stephanie Bolin, I believe, are the folks affected. Ms. Tyler?
And this annexation was prompted by a failed septic system, and as part of connecting to the sanitary sewer system, annexation is required, so it's voluntary. Zoning would remain the same as our 2 single-family residential, and the annexation would be effective the day after the council meeting. Any questions?
Charlie?
I move that we send this to council with recommendation for approval.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? If not, those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Thank you. Next, we have ordinance number 2005-05-066, an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute an amended agreement for use of rights-of-way. This refers to 1701 South Philo Road. Mr. Gray.
Thank you. This is request by Pride Oil to have permission to use right-of-way to install more monitoring wells for a gas station they own at the southwest corner of Florida and Philo. City Council previously had approved a license agreement in March, and work has been done, and their consultant has come back to us recommending that additional monitoring wells be installed. So that is the request. License agreement is largely the same as what was previously approved.
Questions? If not, I take a motion. Charlie?
I'll make a motion after I ask the question here. Are they finding stuff there, or are they?
Yeah, there's contamination, soil contamination from a leaking tank at that gas station, and they're trying to identify the limits of the contamination.
And remediation will be forthcoming, and
correct.
Are they going to have to dig up the streets then? Or?
No. Oh, I'm sorry. No, they need, for EPA requires them to determine the limits of the contamination, but on site itself there may be some removal of tanks, but for the off-site it's going to be pretty much in situ. It would be just remove the source of contamination. There's no additional, and pretty much the microorganisms are going to break down the contamination over time.
I move to send this to council with recommendation for approval.
Second it.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That carries. Next, we have the specialty sign policy discussion, and before getting into this particular thing, it's my understanding from looking at the documentation that this is the same documentation that the previous council was looking at. Is that correct? There hasn't been a change in the document?
There has been some changes.
There have been some changes.
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead, Mr. Gray.
Okay. Apologize for any confusion here on this, but a little background history is that we've received a request from the West Urbana Neighborhood Association to change the street name signs in an area defined by Lincoln, Florida, Race, and Main Street to the north, and change those signs to something that would be more similar to the arched sign look of downtown Urbana. And in looking at this request, we thought it would be appropriate to seek council direction and approval because of its impacts community-wide, if any other requesters would come and want some sort of change to street name signs. There are cost implications and there's maintenance implications and such. Certainly we want designs that are in keeping with conformity of the manual of uniform traffic control devices and appropriately designed signs and such. So we did discuss this a few weeks ago with council to seek input and such on the policy. The comments we received are reflected in this policy you have before you tonight. Okay, so there have been revisions here, and we're just seeking further direction. Generally, it's not often that we have these sorts of policies that come before council, but since this has such a citywide implication and it's a cost implication, that's why it's before you. And if there is approval, whether at this committee meeting or a future committee or council meeting, we're just looking for a motion to approve the policy. So if there's further additions to this policy, that's fine. We can make those additions. But at some point, staff would like to just get a motion to approve a policy, and then we would implement it accordingly.
Okay, Charlie.
I see two things in the policy that I would recommend maybe adding a couple of sentences. In the second paragraph, which says request for signage and sign design and so on, the requester shall notify all property owners. Maybe a third sentence there would be that the city will assist in providing and verifying the mailing lists. As I understand it, community development provided the mailing labels to WUNA for their recent mailing. So maybe a sentence to that effect. Now, of course, the mailing labels can be provided at cost to the group requesting the change. The second one would be in the fourth paragraph down. The material costs shall be borne by the requester. In following the discussion that happened at committee meeting several weeks ago, I don't think it was ever clarified what happens at the end of 10 years when you do the replacement. Are the original requesters going to be approached and asked to contribute again to the differential cost of replacing the signs with the standard ones versus the specialty?
Well, I think that's what we're suggesting. But again, it's for council review and approval.
Well, if that's the request, then I think that there should be a sentence in there that says that, yeah, as part of the replacement cycle, the requesting group will be asked to pony up again. I think that should be in here. The people, the groups that ask this should understand that they're making a commitment every 10 years to provide funding.
Probably isn't clear, but the very last paragraph, I guess we alluded to doing that. We say the city shall be responsible for maintenance of the signs in the absence of future requester funding for replacements of specialty street name signs.
Where is that?
The last paragraph.
Oh.
The city reserves the right to replace the specialty street name signs after their useful life back to the standard green background, white lettered rectangular sign. So we can make that clearer, but what we're suggesting is that, right, in 10 or so years, when it comes time to replace them, we would need a subsequent insertion of that differential in cost, money for that difference in cost for the signs. But it could be that the city will pay for that upgraded sign too, but I think that might cause problems for neighborhoods that don't have a more expensive sign.
Yeah, I guess my recommendation would be to say something a little bit more there if you can.
Other comments? I only have, I made this comment before, and I guess I'll make it again, which is that my biggest concern is the change back. I think once people pay the entire cost of the new signs, I think there's an expectation there, whether they read the policy or not, that they've just paid the entire cost of the signs, not a partial cost, not a differential, but the entire cost, and to have that go away in 10 years, I think would be disturbing to neighborhoods. And so I think if a neighborhood is, I think the cost to do something like this is pretty substantial, and so if a neighborhood is going to put up all of the costs up front, I see that as an investment that the city will continue to maintain those signs on the entire way out. The other option would be that the neighborhood only puts up a piece of the cost, and then it makes more sense that the city would have flexibility. But I think that people get used to their brick sidewalks. People get used to to particular things. They become attached to those things, and I think that the response to the signs going away, except unless you are able to pony up the entire cost of the signs again, it just doesn't make sense. And I just see it as a recipe for something that's a great idea leading to ill will and bad feelings in the future. I don't want us to set us up for that. I understand the budget impacts, but I think that I don't see the budget impact, given that the city just got free signs that it didn't have to buy, and so the life of the signs were extended. I think that we should be investing in maintaining those particular kinds of signs, and that they become a fixture to that neighborhood for a period of time. So that's my main concern. Otherwise, I think it's fine. I did say before that I don't think the Urbana logo is the only image that we should be considering. Maybe something that's more unique to distinguish the different neighborhoods would be useful. But I've said that before. Any other comments? Go ahead, Brandon.
Maybe I should let Brandon do it because he hasn't had a chance to speak yet.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I guess I kind of agree with Chairman Danielle Chenoweth, because if the council approves a section to be designated as a unique section with signage, due to the interest and the commitment of the residents, it does seem odd to then, even though 10 years may not seem such a small section of time, but in the course of life of a city, 10 years is a wink. And it seems to me that if they make a commitment to make their neighborhood unique or special and have signage there, it should continue, and it shouldn't be just a fad. A short run and having all the signs revert because the organization wasn't as functional as it was 10 years previously or something, would be kind of, I think, a bad sign, and it would cause ill will. And it's kind of strange to think you could erase a neighborhood identity just because they, it would be basically erasing the neighborhood identity back to being nothing again. And I think that's it's a direction that the city shouldn't promote. So I don't know if we're going to make a motion on this as written at this point or not, or if so, I think we should reconsider the last paragraph and think more seriously about how the city can partner with the neighborhood to maintain its character.
Brandon, was your comment on this same issue of longevity replacement of signs?
Well, yeah, maybe I will make my comments before we get to the point of making a motion. In general, I feel that the engineering part of this policy is done and is very clear to me, but the planning side of this policy has yet to be worked out. The questions about whether every neighborhood has the right to have a designated neighborhood name and be on a map with the name of its neighborhood, questions about whether all different places in the city have equal right to city funding. I wouldn't want to. I understand the point that Danielle and Dennis, you've made, that once a neighborhood invests in signs, the city should, over time, continue to maintain those good signs. We would put ourselves in a position where there would be ill will if neighbors donated a lot of money for signs, and then after 10 years they were gone, and we said we wouldn't help replace them. But at the same time, some neighborhoods have the ability to make large donations and get nice street signs, and other neighborhoods don't, and I wouldn't want to see us in perpetuity giving city funding to those neighborhoods that manage to, because of their financial abilities, pony up the initial investment and not have any ability to give neighborhood designations to other parts of town that weren't able to make that initial investment. I started doing research and looking at what other cities do, and found that some cities do have neighborhood maps. They adopt names for neighborhoods and give them boundaries, and that creating neighborhoods and character for the neighborhoods and an identity is something that may be in the best interests of the city, so that everybody knows that they live in a neighborhood and feels some sense of pride there. So I think in the long run, I'd like to see that sort of planning be considered by our planning staff, and that sort of policy go along with just this engineering, details of how signs would work. At this point, I am ready to support a motion like this, given that I think it's experimental, and that we'll see who comes forward wanting to give a sign, wanting to have signs in their neighborhood, and given that we will have further discussions about the planning issues and the actual designation of neighborhoods and creation of neighborhoods' identities and ways that we as a city would foster that and create criteria for having that in the whole city.
In the interest of moving this forward, because we've had 2 discussions on this issue, and it's kind of a question of what next, I'd like to do a show of hands on 2 issues. So this is not a vote, it's a show of hands. The first show of hands is those who would support cutting the last sentence of this policy. The effect of cutting that last sentence would mean that the city would not have the option of changing back, but essentially would be responsible for the maintenance of the signs if the neighborhood funded the signs. So could we see a show of hand of folks who would support cutting that sentence at this point? Okay, the second thing I'd like to do a show of hands is what Brandon is describing is something that Chris Alex brought up several weeks ago, and that was to create a neighborhood map of the city, for the city to have some control over what neighborhoods are called, and then for the specialty sign policy to accompany this map, so that neighborhoods that are designated on the map could have signs. So could we see a show of hands of those at this point who would support this policy if there was also an Urbana map where neighborhoods were designated on the map and the city created that map?
Just for clarification.
Yes, go ahead.
Are you saying there's a correlation between the engineering portion and a design that would be compatible to the city for areas? Is that what you're saying?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Basically, you brought up the issue that the fact that the mechanics of doing this is already set in place. The bottom line is there's no significant design criteria associated with this engineering. So they're looking at, I guess, planning to look at what this really means in terms of the various neighborhoods within the community. I think that would be something that should link to this in terms of understanding the complexity of trying to identify various parts of our city by name or areas. And I think it could be detrimental in the long run.
It could be, what's the it?
It could be by designating different areas.
Okay. Could
create more problems than you can imagine.
Okay. So the question on, go ahead, Lynn.
I kind of see what you're saying, Robert. I think that these things sort of erupt, out of kind of a groundswell of interest from community members and neighbors. And so I think this is kind of a nice first step in giving neighborhoods a tool to do more designation. It doesn't box us in. The last paragraph actually gives the city flexibility, because it doesn't say that it won't support it. It just says that we reserve the right to continue to support it. So I see this as just kind of a nice first step, and then I think a lot of these other thoughts are good thoughts, because I think we do want to promote neighborhood pride, neighborhood loyalty. That's all good. So I just think this is a good first step. With maybe that, you had mentioned a change earlier, Charlie, in the 4th paragraph, and I thought that was a substantive change that would be beneficial.
Yeah, there'd be a 3rd sentence on the 2nd paragraph, which would say something like, "The city will assist in providing and verifying the mailing lists."
Just another tool for our neighborhoods.
Okay. So just to try to, I'd like to do a couple of straw polls just so that we can see where we're going. The straw poll on the table is, could we have a straw poll of those who we've heard both pro and con in terms of designating neighborhoods before we move forward.
I have a quick
Go
question.
ahead, Heather.
Are there, I mean, I'm part of a neighborhood association within the neighborhood I live in. And I guess along with that comes a fee every year that we pay into. My thought on that is, I guess the cost concern in 10 years is a concern, but even if I were to sell the house I live in today, the person coming in is still going to pay that neighborhood association fee. So I don't think that having the city responsible in 10 years to do the signs is as great of a concern as you guys may believe it is. That's just a thought on the table.
Okay. Charlie?
I was going to, I think the issue is if you're part of the replacement cycle, we're telling people you pay the differential cost. If you want new signs right now and you're not in the replacement cycle, that it's 8 years away, you pay the full cost. And so that there's a startup thing. I think one way to clarify that very last paragraph might be to say something like this. The city shall be responsible for maintenance of the signs, and that's fairly standard. In the absence of future request or funding for differential costs associated with replacement of specialty street signs, the city reserves the right to replace the specialty street signs. So I'm adding the 4 words here, differential costs associated with, in place of that. So it's very clear that it's the differential costs, once you're into the replacement cycle, basically, that there may be an expectation that groups would have to pay for that.
I'm getting a sense of the council that well, let me do a straw poll on neighborhood maps. Is there an interest in the city only moving forward with this at this point if there's also a component of having designated neighborhoods? Just show of hands, those who would support a designation of neighborhoods.
Only if...
Those who would support adding to this policy as it exists now, a designation of neighborhoods. Okay, we see a couple of hands. What I would propose at this point is that we, if the committee is ready, is to do a motion with some of the changes that Charlie, you've suggested, because I get a sense that there's some consensus around that. So do you want to put that motion on the floor?
I move that we send this policy to council with the two changes that I've proposed. In the second paragraph, that the city will assist in providing and verifying the mailing lists, and in the last paragraph, that we add the wording funding for differential costs associated with, those 4 words inserted in before replacement of specialty street signs.
I second it.
And is your motion to send this with these changes to council with the recommendation for approval?
That's correct.
Okay. So we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Go ahead, Charlie.
One quick thing. Given that the West Urbana Neighborhood Association started this up, that they've already notified the residents, that the process has already begun, is there an expectation that they will have to do another round of notifying people? No. Okay.
I don't have that expectation. no.
Okay. Okay. Are we also in a position where their signs are ready to be approved, or are we still waiting for, at what point do we?
I can bring that sign to the next meeting, have a copy for all of you to look at.
Okay. Would it be appropriate then to have a second motion then maybe to send that to council as well? Sure. Okay, well, I'll do that separately then. Finish this one.
Okay. So we have a motion. Is there any other discussion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? We move that to council. Charlie?
Okay, I move approval of the West Urbana neighborhood sign, or I move that we send that approval to council.
It's this, but I'll make copies for everybody, so,
Okay, we'll pass this down.
without the logo.
This would go to council with recommendation for approval, and we would have an ability to see it in our next council packet. So we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Dennis?
Well, we haven't really been shown these yet, have we? I mean, this is like, I mean, I guess we've kind of seen
saw it
sketches,
before.
but we just heard from Bill Gray that the logo would be removed. That's a significant change in how they look. So while we're preparing and have moved to send the resolution to the ordinance, I guess it's a resolution, to approve these neighborhood signs in general, I think that we might want to take more time and look at the specific proposal of the Wuna neighborhood and not necessarily link it immediately to this.
That's fine.
In other words, give a little bit of breathing room. This is like a second question, and I don't feel compelled to pre-approve their sign tonight or want to do it tomorrow.
Okay.
I'm saying that I think we have time to think about this.
Should we possibly put it on committee 2 weeks from now, then?
That's probably more appropriate.
Okay,
Would you like to withdraw your
I'll
motion?
withdraw my motion and change it to sending that to committee 2 weeks from now.
I'll withdraw my second.
Okay, we have a motion on the table. Is there a second?
The motion is to send it to committee now.
We have a
In 2
second.
weeks.
In
Yes.
2 weeks, you mean?
Second.
Well, I would second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? That carries, so we've moved the first motion to council and the design itself to committee. Okay, next week, we have a couple more minutes. Let's see how far we can get with mailings. We have mailings and a change in rules. I'm going to hand it over to Charlie to explain his memo.
Yeah, real quickly, if you're like me, we got 7 pieces of mail Friday and Saturday in 6 different envelopes. I've summarized them, they're 1- and 2-page notes. None of them were critical. All of them could have come in email if they needed to be that urgent, and/or they could have shown up on my desk tonight in a folder of stuff. In the library board, we were handed a folder every month with stuff that could wait till we got there, sort of thing. That additional cost was $2.45 on top of the $3.95 for the packet. I don't know how many of these things go out, but there are a lot of them, besides just us that get these. It just strikes me that we need to come up with it's a small amount of money, but it adds up to a lot of money over time. Now, granted, some of the things like this we needed to have in hand, whether some of the weekly packets don't need this kind of mail delivery and can come by email. I'd like to really ask staff to look at this very closely, examine how they can do this via electronic means, just the whole flow of paper to us that really is unnecessary. The invitation, a separate invitation here and a separate invitation there, that all could have waited for tonight. So I basically just like to direct staff to come up with a more cost-effective means of communicating these materials to us and to the public, and report back in about a month on steps that could be proposed to reduce postage costs and paper use.
Second.
Just to clarify, because this wasn't on the agenda for tonight, I don't think it should be a motion.
It's just a request of staff.
It sounds like something that Mr. Walden can act on without a motion, and you can bring something back to this committee to report on. So why don't we handle it that way?
Great.
Okay. Next, we have the rules motion.
In a similar fashion, in going over the rules tonight, the one thing I noticed from the last council was that the committee chair tonight will not report the actions of this committee to council at the next session, that it's somebody else that takes over, and that seems to me a bit backwards. So what I'd like to do is ask staff to draw up the correct language that would modify that particular Rule C or Rule 3 or whatever it is in the Urbana Council rules, and bring that back to committee for consideration in 2 weeks.
Sounds like a good
I'm seeing a
idea.
lot of nodding heads, so I think we can also communicate that to staff. Okay, any other comments from committee members? If not, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Good job, you guys.
Good.